All right, thank you very much, Tony, for doing that. My name's David Borden. I'm the board chairman, Striped Bass board chairman. I'm the governor's appointee from the state of Rhode Island, and I get to moderate the session today. In terms of process, I've asked Tony to follow the following rules. She's basically going to call on individuals. So if the board members who want to speak will have to raise your hand, you'll go on a list. Tony will call on you in order. She will not call on you twice until we go through the list. So hopefully everyone on the list gets an opportunity to talk at least once. And if we have more time, we'll go back through the list and let individuals who have a particular interest in it subject to possibly speak on an issue twice. The process today, we're going to move through the agenda, hopefully orderly. I would anticipate that on most of these issues, we will not need motions, and I would prefer to do the business of the board by consensus if that's possible. I'm going to take the items as they appear on the published agenda. Approval of the agenda. Are there any additions, deletions on the agenda or changes? Any hands up, Tony?
No hands, David.
Okay, so the agenda stands approved as distributed. We have two sets of proceedings that we need to approve. Are there any comments on the March 2021 proceedings? Any hands up?
No hands, David.
Then the March 2021 proceedings stands approved by consensus. May 2021, any comments, additions, deletions to those proceedings? Any hands up?
No hands.
Okay, so the May 2021 proceedings stand approved by consensus. Public comments, the two aspects of public comments. We normally afford the public an opportunity to comment on issues which are not on the agenda. You're going to be limited to a minute or two, depending upon how many individuals. And then during the actual meeting, I may or may not take public comments if we get to motions. Depends on the nature of the issue and whether or not there's been an opportunity for the public to already weigh in on the issue. So are there any individuals that would like to speak to an issue which is not on the agenda? And if so, please raise your hand.
Don't see any. No hands.
No hands? So there are no hands up, so there are no public comments. So the first item of business is consider the fishery management plan review and state compliance for 2020. Emily Frank, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. All right, let me just get my screen pulled up here. All right, can everyone see my slide up on the screen?
Yes.
Great, thanks so much, Tony. All right, so this morning, as the chair mentioned, our first agenda item is the fishery management plan review for the 2020 fishing year. So the plan review team reviewed state compliance reports for 2020 in July and drafted the FMP review report, which was included in the supplemental materials. I'd like to thank the plan review team members for their time reviewing the compliance reports and preparing the draft for the board's review today. So there's a lot of detail in the written report. So in today's presentation, I'll just go over some key points. So to start out, I'll just give a brief overview of the status of the stock, followed by the status of the fishery management plan focused on Addendum 6. Then I'll move into the status of the fishery, the status of the management measures, and then conclude the presentation today with comments from the plan review team. So starting with status of the stock, based on the results of the 2018 benchmark stock assessment, the striped bass stock is overfished and experiencing overfishing. And just as a reminder, the benchmark does incorporate the newly calibrated MRIP estimates. In 2017, female spawning stock biomass was estimated at 68,476 metric tons, which is below both the target and the threshold for spawning stock biomass. Fishing mortality was estimated at 0.31 in 2017, which is above the threshold of 0.24. You can see in the figure here of female spawning stock biomass, which is the blue shaded area, that spawning stock biomass has declined steadily since the time series high in about 2003 and has been below the threshold since 2013. And there was a period of low recruitment since about 2005, and recruitment is those orange bars there. However, there were a few strong year classes in 2011, 2014, and 2015. This is a figure of fishing mortality, and you can see here that fishing mortality was estimated to be at or above the threshold for 13 of the last 15 years. So moving on to status of the fishery management plan. Amendment 6 and the addenda 1 through 6 set the management program for fishing year 2020. And the addendum 6 measures that were designed to reduce total removals by 18% relative to 2017 levels were implemented by the states by April 1st of 2020. Addendum 6 also requires the mandatory use of circle hooks when fishing with bait in the recreational fishery, and those measures were implemented in 2021. And then finally, draft amendment 7 is under development, which we'll discuss later in the agenda today. But that draft amendment will address 4 issues: recreational release mortality, conservation equivalency, management triggers, and measures to protect the 2015 year class. So as I mentioned, Addendum 6 measures were implemented in 2020 to reduce total recreational removals by 18%. The measures reduced state commercial quotas by 18%. The measures implemented a 1 fish bag limit and a 28-inch to less than 35-inch slot limit for the ocean fisheries, and a 1 fish bag limit and an 18-inch minimum size limit in the Chesapeake Bay. And some states implemented alternative regulations through conservation equivalency, and those regulations had to achieve an 18% reduction in total removals statewide. This figure here shows fishery performance over time by sector. So you can see at the bottom there, commercial harvest is in blue and commercial discards are in red. And those have been relatively stable over time since the fishery has been managed by a static quota system since 2015. Most of the removals of striped bass are coming from the recreational sector. You can see recreational harvest in green on this figure and recreational release mortality in purple. And in 2020, the recreational sector, so the total harvest and release mortality, accounted for about 88% of total striped bass removals. And recreational removals have been variable through time, but you can see they've been decreasing in recent years. So this slide is a broad view of fishery performance in 2020. And any percent change you see here on this slide is a percent change as compared to the previous year of 2019. And again, as a reminder, 2020 was the first year that Addendum 6 measures were implemented. So in 2020, the commercial fishery harvested an estimated 3.39 million pounds, or about 531,240 fish. And this is a 20% decrease by weight relative to 2019 and a 19% decrease by number. On the recreational side, in 2020, total recreational harvest was estimated at about 1.71 million fish, which is a 21% decrease relative to 2019. And as we've discussed, the vast majority of the recreational striped bass catch is released alive, and 9% of those fish that are released alive are assumed to die as a result of being caught. So in 2020, recreational anglers caught and released an estimated 30.7 million fish, and of those, about 2.8 million were assumed to have died. And this is a 7% increase relative to 2019. And then overall, the recreational release mortality, so those 2.8 million fish that are assumed to have died, were about 54% of total striped bass removals from both sectors in 2020. So here you can see a summary of commercial quota and harvest by state. So in 2020, there were no quota overages, either in the ocean fishery or the Chesapeake Bay fishery. And in 2020, commercial harvest from the Chesapeake Bay accounted for about 62% of total commercial landings by weight. Again, as I mentioned, the majority of striped bass that are caught recreationally are released alive. And this figure here shows that while the recreational catch varies from year to year, the proportion of fish that are released alive remains pretty high, about 90% per year, going back to the early 1990s. And in 2020, 95% of fish that were caught recreationally were released alive. And as I mentioned, this recreational release mortality was over half of total removals of striped bass in 2020. One thing that the plan review team included in the FMP review this year is a note about 2020 MRIP data. The component of MRIP that samples the dockside catch rate data was interrupted by COVID-19. So due to this interruption, the catch rate data were imputed as needed. So using data from 2018 and 2019 to generate those total catch estimates for 2020. So the PRT included this table here in the report, which shows the contribution of imputed data for striped bass, which varies by state and by estimate as shown in the table here. So if you see a higher percentage of imputed data, that indicates that data from 2018 and 2019 are having more of an impact on those 2020 estimates. And so moving on to the status of management measures. The first is the analysis of the juvenile abundance indices. So this year's analysis evaluated the 2018, 2019, and 2020 JAI values. So if any surveys JAI falls below their first quartile for 3 consecutive years, which is defined in Addendum 2, then appropriate action should be recommended by the technical committee. And the next item, agenda item, will cover this in more detail. But North Carolina, which is down here in the lower right-hand corner, met the criteria for recruitment failure for 2018, 2019, and 2020. And again, we'll hear more about this in the next agenda item. Maine's Juvenile Abundance Index, which is up here in the upper left-hand corner, was below its first quartile in 2019 and 2020. And then Maryland's Juvenile Abundance Index, which is up here in the upper right-hand corner, was below its first quartile value in 2020. So moving on to Addendum 6. So in 2020, a 28% reduction in total removals coastwide in numbers of fish was realized relative to the total removals coastwide in 2017. Again, as a reminder, Addendum 6 was designed to achieve an 18% reduction in total removals relative to 2017. So this table here on the screen shows those coastwide reductions by sector. So you see coastwide, there was about a 14% reduction from 2017 for the commercial sector, and for the recreational sector, there was about a 30% reduction from 2017. And again, this is coastwide in numbers of fish. This table here on the screen is included in the report and lists the realized change for recreational removals in numbers of fish by state from 2017 to 2020. At the request of the board, this table also shows the predicted reduction in recreational removals from those states that implemented conservation equivalency plans. And you can see that the reductions vary by state, and the plan review team notes that differences in performance are influenced by a number of factors, including changes in effort, changes in fish availability, year classes moving along the coast, as well as environmental factors. And another note is you can see that increases in recreational releases in the Mid-Atlantic, in New Jersey, Delaware, and New York contributed to those realized reductions being less than predicted for those states. So again, this is included, this full table is included in the report. On the commercial side, this table shows the percent change in commercial harvest by weight by state from 2017 to 2020. For reference, it also shows the percent change in commercial quota. Again, some states chose to take less than an 18% reduction through conservation equivalency. So you can see the percent change in commercial quota there on the right. And then in the middle, you can see the percent change in commercial harvest by weight in 2020 relative to 2017. So in the ocean, we saw about a 38% decrease in commercial harvest, and in the bay, we saw about a 23% decrease in commercial harvest in pounds. All right, so to wrap up here, I'll go through the comments from the plan review team. So in 2020, all states implemented a management and monitoring program consistent with the provisions of the Striped Bass Fishery Management Plan. And the PRT notes there's one inconsistency, and that is that New York's recreational regulations state a slot limit of 28 inches to 35 inches, and this does not explicitly indicate whether the upper limit is inclusive or not. And then as far as de minimis, there were no requests for a de minimis status in 2020. Looking into 2021, the PRT noted that Maryland's 2021 summer closure period, so this year it was a closure, a no targeting closure from July 16th to July 31st, is inconsistent with their approved 2020 closure period, which was no targeting in August 16th through 31st. And then as far as the circle hook requirements that were implemented in 2021, the PRT noted that some states have implemented more restrictive definitions of bait than the definition that the board approved back in March. Several states have implemented the incidental catch guidance that the board also discussed in March. And then there is one delay in the circle hook rule, and that's in New Jersey. That rule has been delayed, but is expected to be fully implemented in October of this year. And then finally, the PRT had a couple comments on commercial tagging. So the PRT noted that in multiple states, only about half or less than half of the issued commercial tags were reported used. And the PRT emphasizes the importance of tag accounting for unused tags. Maryland was not able to conduct a tag audit due to COVID-19. And just as a general follow-up, the PRT recommends that commission staff work with the law enforcement committee to regularly follow up with all states on tag accounting moving forward. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
All right, thank you very much, Emily. The good news from the report is Commission met its addendum 6 target of 18%, actually exceeded it substantially, so that is good news. So what I would like to do is take the comments in two segments, just general comments on the report if there are any, And then I would like to talk about specifically about the recommendations from the PRT in regards Maryland and New York, and I'll take those up separately. So anyone want to comment generally on the report at this phase or ask a question? Any hands up, Tony?
I don't have any hands.
Okay, so does anyone want to comment on the plan review team recommendation on New York in particular? Or does someone from the New York delegation want to speak to the point? Any hands up?
No hands.
Okay, so no comment on the New York issue. On Maryland, the plan review team also gave us a recommendation. Did somebody from the delegation in Maryland want to comment on it, or does someone on the board want to comment? Any hands up?
Mike Luisi has his hand up.
Mike, you're next, and then I'll take anyone else. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This came to our attention when the plan review team was going through our changes in regulation. And so I think just for transparency, I just wanted to clear the air and let everyone know that in 2020, when we put our conservation equivalency plan together and we came up with a 2-week closure period in August, the August period was the second week of August was the closure that we implemented in 2020 with a cap as far as not extending that into any future year. And we did so because of the timing of our regulation process and the amendment, the addendum process. And it did not allow for us to put the closure where we wanted it to be, which was during that time period in July, which is what we did this year. Now, the analysis that was done for our conservation equivalency, the closure period in August and the closure period in July were the exact same number of days during the same wave, during wave 4. And so we felt that the analysis would have been no different from what it had been the previous year. However, the water quality indicators as far as temperature and air temperature are much worse in the second half of July than they are at the end of August. And so we made a concerted effort to find that period of time where the water quality is at its peak as far as the poor water quality for striped bass. And that's when we implemented our closure for this year. So we made a more conservative effort to protect those fish in July while they were at kind of their weakest point as far as the conditions in the bay. So, you know, that's what we decided internally. We had hearings on it and we dealt with the issue at hand. The analysis would be no different at all because of it's still within wave 4, and the reduction that was part of our conservation equivalency program that was approved would have been no different because every day in wave 4 counts for the same amount of reduction. And so I'll leave it there, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to answer questions. I also have a graph that we used from another area. So you can see this is the graph that kind of gave us the information that we used to implement those measures. You can see that on the far right, the block was the August time period, and this is bay water temperatures, surface water temperatures, and so we backed up that time period to the second half of July, which you can see is that it's on the left. It's the dotted line. That's when we see our peak in poor water quality, and that's why we made the decision that we did. And I'm happy to answer any questions if people have questions about that, but I'll leave it up to you, Mr. Chairman. But that's the reason for the change. And we didn't feel that we needed to do another conservation equivalency program or another conservation equivalency document since it was all within Wave 4.
Thank you, Mike. Anyone else want to comment on this issue? Tony?
I have no hands, Mr. Chairman. I will say that I noticed Maureen opened her mic, but she didn't raise her hand. So I wasn't sure if she was trying to speak prior to the New York issue.
Let's finish with this issue and I'll go back to Maureen if she would like to speak. Anyone else care to speak on this issue? If not, we'll go back to the New York situation. Any hands up, Tony?
No hands up currently, no.
Oh, okay, Maureen, do you want to go back to the New York issue? I'll afford you an opportunity to comment if you would like to.
Oh, thank you. I just really wanted to say that for our excuse our calculated reduction with the numbers that we used was greater than what was required. So we felt that we were fine since we were going to have a larger reduction than was required. And the difference that's currently in question right now is not really something that's enforceable when our law enforcement is out on the water. So we felt that the numbers that we went with were fine.
Thank you, Maureen. Any questions for Maureen or the New York delegation?
Adam Nowalski?
Adam?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually wanted to go back to general questions when you're done with this New York issue. If you'll afford me that opportunity, couldn't get my hand up quick enough before. Thank you.
Certainly. Any questions for Maureen? If not, any hands up, Tony?
No other hands.
Okay, so Adam, you're back to general question.
Okay. Mike Armstrong actually did put his hand up, sorry. It was a little slow.
Okay, so we'll take Mike Armstrong and then I'm going to go to Adam. Mike.
Thank you. Sorry for the delay. If we could go back to Maryland a minute, and I just need to recollect for Mike, was that the closure was only for recreational, right? Not for the commercial fishery, which I believe is hook and line at the same time.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I can jump in if you're okay with that.
Certainly.
Okay. Yeah, so the closure period, the closure was a target closure. So there's no catch and release. It's a complete closure with no targeting of striped bass for both the for-hire and the recreational fishery. The commercial fishery still operated during that time period. And what I will say is that since we've gone to the individual transferable quota system from back in 2013, 2014-ish time period, we have very few hook and line fishermen anymore. The average number of boats on the water in any given day is about 5. And so they continue to operate. They operate differently than the recreational fishery. Obviously, they're there to catch their quota and move on. They're not there to catch and release and throw fish back. So, but yeah, Mike, hopefully that answers your question. Each year, we've committed to reviewing whether or not the commercial fishery should continue to operate during this closure period. This year, the administration decided to leave it open. But next year is another story, and we work with our advisors, and we get information from them, both commercial and recreational, and we try to make that decision each year based on the best available information we have.
Mike, did that address your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mike Luisi, for doing that. Any other questions other than Adam's? If not, we're going to move back to Adam on a general question. Adam.
Thank you very much. You're doing a great job of moving very efficiently this morning. My question was with regards to the total removals as a combination of the dead discards and the landings. As part of the FMP review, does staff compile a trend analysis of the percentage of removals that come as a function of the landings versus the dead discards from release mortality, or is that something that can be compiled elsewhere, found elsewhere?
Emily or Katie want to address that?
Sure, this is Emily. Thanks for the question, Adam. We do have that information available. We just typically have not included that in the report, but we could add it as a table, for example, to the report if that would be helpful, just showing the contribution of each of those parts of the fishery: commercial removals, commercial discards, recreational removals, recreational discards, their contribution to the total removal.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in seeing that, and I would recommend that that certainly be part of future fishery management plans unless there was objection to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Any other general comments or questions?
Richie White.
Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for Emily. New Jersey's not making the reduction, 18% reduction. Could that be, or is it attributable to their conservation equivalency regulations? And is that something that could be determined?
Thanks for the question. That's not something that the PRT could determine, again, since performance is influenced by a variety of factors, including changes in effort, availability of year classes. So looking at a state-specific performance in comparison to the predicted change from their conservation equivalency plan, the PRT can't pinpoint exactly what factors cause that change to be, or that percent reduction to be less than what was predicted. And Katie, please feel free to add anything.
No, I think you've covered it. It's definitely, again, that kind of, if you look at the change in effort, is certainly a big component, as is the fact that New Jersey was one of the states that had a fairly high impact of the APIS change, and therefore you're pulling more years of data from before, or more records from before that management change as well. So all of those things are hard to separate out from the actual management measures themselves.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
No other hands.
So the action on this is to approve the report as submitted. Is that correct, Emily?
Yes, and I believe Maya has a draft motion. Maya, if you want to take the control back of the screen. Thank you.
Well, yeah, if you could put the draft motion up. Given the lack of questions and controversy, I think we can probably do this by consensus, but I think it would be helpful to have a motion up on the board. All right, so the motion is to approve the FMP review for 2020 fishing year and state compliance reports. Is there any objection to approving this by consensus? Anyone object? Any hands up, Tony?
No hands, but Mr. Chairman, if we could have a maker and a seconder, and we had hands up, Emerson Hasbrook as a maker and Mike Armstrong as a seconder.
Okay, so we've got a motion and a second. Thank you for keeping me on track. Any objection to approving this by consensus? Any hands up? Motion stands approved by unanimous consensus.
And Maya, that seconder was Mike Armstrong.
All right, next item on the agenda is item 5, which is a review of the Juvenile Abundance Index for Albemarle Sound. And we're going to start off with a technical committee report by Carol Hoffman. Carol?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can, Carol.
Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so the Juvenile Abundance Index for the Albemarle Sound Overnight River Stock showed recruitment failure for 3 consecutive years in 2018, 19, and 20. And that tripped our recruitment trigger that was established in Amendment 6, which showed that if there were 3 consecutive years where the JAI was below the first quartile, then appropriate action should be recommended to the board. And in response to this, the TC met on July 15th of this year. Can I have the next slide? The solid black line at the bottom near the x-axis on the screen is the first quartile for JAI for value for the period of 1955 to 2009, and that's 1.33. And in 2018, it was 0.4. 2019, it was 1.2, and 2020, it was 0.02. Can I have the next slide, please? So in addition, there was already management action that North Carolina has taken, because in 2020, there was a stock assessment that showed that the stock was overfished and that overfishing is occurring. And in response to this, the TAL, the total allowable landings, were reduced in 2021 and for 2022 as well. And they were reduced from 275,000 pounds to about 51,000 pounds to get fishing mortality to the target level. Can I have the next slide? In addition, North Carolina did an analysis of flow and showed a correlation between young of the year recruitment and flow, increased flow in above a certain range, and showed that as flow increases above a certain level, year class strength decreases, particularly in May when the spawning stock, when the striped bass are spawning, and the low JAI values, again from 2017 actually to 2020, aligned with high flow rates that exceeded that limit. Can I have the next slide, please? So in response to this, North Carolina developed a stocking contingency plan. If the flows from the Roanoke Rapids Dam meet or exceed 12,000 cubic feet per second, which is the rate at which the river starts to overflow for at least 14 days, from May 1st to June 10th, which is the critical spawning and transport period, then there is a stocking program for striped bass to be stocked in the western Albemarle Sound nursery area. Can I have the next slide, please? So at this time, the TC recommends no action be taken by the board, considering that North Carolina has already taken management action by reducing their total allowable landings and also by having their contingency stocking program by monitoring and analysis of river flow. Can I have the next slide, please? So in summary, the JAI was low for 3 years in a row, which tripped the stock recruitment failure trigger. Per Amendment 6, the TC met to recommend appropriate action, and the TC recommends no action by the board due to the fact that North Carolina has already reduced the total allowable landings and because they have their contingency stocking program in place. Can I have the next slide, please? And does anyone have any questions?
All right, thank you, Carol. Let me just interject that it does not appear that this item requires any action by the board. North Carolina has been very proactive and taken action in advance. So let me just ask for questions, and then if there's nothing of substance that comes up, we'll move on. I don't believe it requires any action at all, even to accept a report. So questions for Carol?
Carol, just a reminder to turn off your mic when you're not speaking, and then we have Mike Armstrong followed by Mike Luisi.
Mike Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I applaud, the proactive measures that North Carolina has done very quickly, and I hope things turn around. Just one question: the quota was 275,000. You reduced it to 50-something thousand. Was in fact the 275 being fully utilized?
I'd have to go back and look at that, but I know that the 50,000 was to reduce the F down to the target.
Mr. Chair, you have Chris Bat-Savage, who could probably answer that question.
Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it depends on the commercial and recreational sectors, and also, well, we have commercial fishery, which takes up 50% of the TAL, and then the recreational is the other 50, which is split between Albemarle Sound and the Roanoke River. And if memory serves me, I don't think the quota was reached every year in those years overall, mostly in the commercial fishery. And I think on the recreational fishery, it depended. It might, they might hit their allocation in the Roanoke River, but not Albemarle Sound, and vice versa. But it wasn't full utilization of the 275 every year.
Thank you.
Mike Armstrong, you finished, or you have a follow-up?
No, I'm all set. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Mike Luisi?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. This question might be for Chris as well, since he's on the line. Chris, do you guys do a spawning stock biomass survey in the spring? Are you sampling the fish that are coming in that spawn? And I just wonder if some of the reason for the recruitment failure might just be that the fish aren't moving into the sounds anymore, and they're moving more north. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you have any data that would suggest that maybe just spawning isn't occurring there anymore.
Mr. Chair, if it's okay, I can attempt to answer that at least. Thanks for the question, Mike. Yes, we do have a spawning stock survey, an adult gillnet survey in Albemarle Sound. It was suspended last year due to COVID concerns. There's also electro fishing survey on the Upper Roanoke River on the spawning grounds. So we do monitor that. That information goes into the stock assessment. In terms of are we seeing just less spawning fish due to them moving north? I don't know. I think that would probably be a better question, answered better by our technical staff that I don't think are on the call today. However, I know it's probably more of a function of just in terms of these poor year classes, the river flow, stock size, probably plays a role as well. But as we know, a small spawning stock can produce a large year class if conditions are optimal. And in the last few years, we haven't seen that. So kind of long-winded way of saying I'm not real sure, but just wanted to give a little bit of background information, answer at least part of your question. But thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. That's all I had.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you for Chris. Any other questions on this? Any hands up, Tony?
No additional hands.
Okay, so I'd just like to thank the North Carolina delegation for the way they've handled this issue. I think they've been, as I indicated before, extremely proactive, and that's exactly the type of leadership we need. So thank you very much to the entire delegation. We're going to move on to the next item, which is a progress report on draft Amendment 7. Emily, you're up.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. I will just pull up here. Excellent. All right. Just one moment here.
And before Emily starts, I'll provide some guidance on how I want to handle the issues at the conclusion of her presentation. Emily?
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Chair.
I'm finished. If you could do the report, please.
All right, thanks for your patience. All right, so today I will be providing an update, as the chair mentioned, on the development of draft Amendment 7 and highlighting where the plan development team and technical committee are requesting board guidance on some of the issues being developed for the amendment. So I'll start with a brief background and the timeline for Amendment 7, and then I'll move into each issue and provide a brief overview of what the plan development team and technical committee have been discussing and identify where they are requesting guidance from the board. So just to recap a little background here, in August 2020, the board initiated the development of Amendment 7 to address a number of issues facing striped bass management. And the purpose of the amendment is to update the management program to reflect current fishery needs and priorities, since the status and understanding of the resource has changed considerably since Amendment 6 was approved in 2003. And in February of this year, the board approved for public comment the Public Information Document, or PID, for Draft Amendment 7. And this scoping document sought public input on a number of important management issues. And after the public comment period on the PID, at the May board meeting, the board approved 4 issues for development in Draft Amendment 7. And those issues are recreational release mortality, conservation equivalency, management triggers, and measures to protect the 2015 year class. So over the past few months, the plan development team and the technical committee have met multiple times to begin developing options and analysis for the draft amendment. And during these meetings, the PDT and the TC identified specific questions requesting guidance from the board on the types of options that should be developed for some of these issues. And guidance from the board at this point in the process is important to ensure that the draft options meet the board's intent and objectives for these issues in the draft amendment. And then based on guidance provided by the board today, the PDT will continue developing options for draft Amendment 7 over the next several weeks. So here's the current timeline for Amendment 7. As I mentioned, the board started this process in August of last year, and the PID process was completed this spring. So we're in this current step of the PDT developing the draft amendment document. So again, between now and October, the PDT will prepare the draft amendment with the intent of presenting it to the board in October, when the board could consider approving the draft for public comment. And then after a public comment period, the earliest the final amendment could be approved is February of next year. So for the remainder of my slides today, I'll provide a brief overview of what the PDT and TC have discussed for each issue, but most of the presentation will focus on the specific questions requesting guidance from the board. And those questions for the board are related to recreational release mortality, conservation equivalency, and the recruitment trigger. So I'll pause after each question or set of questions, if okay with the chair, and if the board would like to discuss and provide guidance on some of these questions before moving on to the next issue. And the memos from the plan development team and the technical committee that were prepared for this meeting were part of the main meeting materials, and they outline all of these questions and challenges in more detail. And I'd like to thank the PDT and TC members for all their time these past few months and in the coming weeks. So to kick us off here, I'll start out with recreational release mortality. In order to reduce recreational release mortality, the board could consider two approaches. The board could consider additional gear restrictions to help increase the chance of survival after being released. For example, Addendum 6 requires the use of circle hooks when fishing recreationally with bait to reduce this post-release mortality. Another approach would be for the board to consider effort controls to reduce the number of trips interacting with striped bass and therefore reduce the overall number of striped bass releases. So the PDT is considering the following types of options to address recreational release mortality, and the PDT is still working through these potential options. So this is not a final list, just hopefully to give the board an idea of the types of options that the PDT is discussing. So for gear restrictions, the PDT is discussing various options, including the use of non-lethal devices for removing striped bass from the water, for example, and the use of barbless hooks. For fish handling, the PDT is discussing a potential option to require the in-water release of large fish. For outreach and education, the PDT is discussing options for public outreach campaigns in the states and also an option for an educational video and quiz. And then finally, for effort controls, the PDT is primarily discussing seasonal closures. And today, the PDT is requesting guidance on these effort controls, seasonal closures, which again are intended to reduce the number of live releases by reducing the number of fishing trips that interact with striped bass. So the primary question from the PDT to the board today is what types of effort control options should be included in the draft amendment? And the PDT has identified 3 decision points for the board on this issue. So the first is related to the geographic scope of the closures. The next is related to a reduction target or lack thereof. And the third is related to the type of closure. So thinking about a no targeting closure versus a no harvest closure. So first, for the geographic scope, closures could be either coast-wide or they could be state or region-specific. So from a coast-wide perspective, coast-wide closures would ensure consistency in the timing of closures across all the states. But one of the primary challenges here would be equitability. Since recreational fisheries operate very differently along the coast, coast-wide closures would result in different levels of effort reduction across the states. And these closures would impact each state fishery differently based on the timing and what fish are available at that time in certain areas, and then also based on the current management measures that are already in place within each state. And then on the other hand, state-specific or regional closures could help account for unique biological or socioeconomic considerations, as well as regulatory consistency. However, state-specific closures could result in more of a patchwork of different closures as you move along the coast. And for state-specific closures, the PDT would not be able to develop specific options for each state. States would need to develop their own proposals for closures that they would then pursue through their state regulatory and public processes. And they would also submit to the Commission for TC review and board approval as part of their state implementation plans. And the PDT could develop some options that might set some parameters on the scope of state closures. However, the state level MRIP data needed to look at these different types of closures would likely have high PSEs, particularly when looking at specific waves. So the second decision point related to seasonal closures is related to the target reduction or the basis for a closure. So without a specific target reduction in mind, it's difficult for the PDT to develop specific closure options. So without a target for reducing effort, for example, a % reduction the board is looking for to reduce effort, then the PDT requests guidance from the board on which days or months or waves the board would like to consider for the closures. And then without any additional direction at this point, the PDT would only be able to focus on options for biological and ecological based closures. So for example, closures based on spawning or closures based on peak temperature periods. And then the final decision point is on the type of closure. So as I mentioned, the draft amendment could include options for both no harvest and no targeting closures, or the options could only focus on one type of closure. The PDT assumes a maximum reduction of efforts and therefore reduction in number of releases would be achieved with a no targeting closure. The PDT does recognize that there are some concerns about enforceability with no targeting closures, and there's also some uncertainty around the level of compliance. For a no harvest closure, the PDT notes that anglers may shift their trips to catch and release trips, and this could increase the number of releases, which would then be counter to the objective of reducing releases. So overall, choosing which type of closure may depend on the reason for the closure, but with any type of closure, there will still be fishing trips that incidentally interact with striped bass. And then there will also be some striped bass trips that shift effort to target other species. And then finally, different closure scenarios could be explored with MRIP effort data. But again, there are some challenges in that changes in angler behavior are unpredictable, and also catch and release trips are not separable in MRIP. So with that, Mr. Chair, those 3 decision points for effort controls to address recreational release mortality are summarized here on the screen. If you want to pause for board discussion on this before we move on to the next issue.
Right, thank you, Emily. What I'd like to do is take each one of these questions that are up on the board and basically go through them one by one and try to get a consensus on it without a motion, if possible. Keep in mind that what we're developing is a draft public hearing document with a range of options. So it's quite possible we can have more than one option or a couple of different options developed and then review them at the next meeting. Obviously, you want to narrow the choices so that it limits the scope of the work that the technical people have to do. But I think it's desirable to go through these one by one and get some comments on it and see if we can get a consensus and then move on. And just remember that you're going to see this all again with greater detail at the next meeting. So general comments on what type of effort control option should be included. And the first question is, should the closures be coastwide or should they be state specific? Anyone want to speak to that point?
I'm waiting for hands to come up, Mr. Chair. We have Richie White, then Marty Gary.
Richie and then Marty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would favor the state regional option. I think it's too difficult for the length of season when you look at northern states in relation to southern states, that the southern states have a much longer time period. So I would think that a closure ought to be a percentage, and that would be difficult. I mean, that would work for the amount of time that striped bass are in a jurisdiction. So that would be my recommendation. Thanks.
Thanks, Richie. Marty?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm inclined to agree with Richie, although I guess part of me is wondering, I'd like to hear from the public. My sense is Richie's right, you know, this regional scope is probably more applicable, but I just wonder, and I know the PDT, I don't want to frustrate them by giving them a lack of guidance, but you know, unless we absolutely have to narrow it down, you know, this is one that maybe we still need to hear from the public about. Keep them both in, but I'd like to hear from others if they have a thought on it. Thank you.
You have Mike Luisi, then Tom Foti.
Mike and Tom next. Mike?
Dave, who'd you call on, Mike or me first?
Yeah, I was having a hard time turning off my mute, Mr. Chairman, but thanks. Yeah, I have to agree with Richie. I think there's enough difference in the geographic range of this species that state-specific or regional closure should be where the PDT should be focused, rather than a coast-wide closure for all states at the same time. I just, you know, as we just talked about maybe half an hour ago, you know, we have certain information in our state here in Maryland that suggested that we have a closure period that may be completely different from what Virginia has on record, or Delaware or New Jersey. And so I would like to see the state regional closure explored more and have that allowance for the states to come up with whatever that closure is. Now, I guess you're going to get into the reduction target, and I'm interested to hear what people have to say about the target as to how we're going to reduce releases. So, but that's my point at this time. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Tom Foti.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand what Richie's saying, but when we look at the reduction that goes on, and if you do an area closure, and I'll point out the Raritan Bay because there's some suggestions we do a Raritan Bay. If you close that during a certain period of time, that might be the only period of time, like in the Chesapeake Bay, where people actually, because of the regulations, because we don't have spawning area regulations, but just coastwide regulations, is they only see fish big enough to catch during that period of time. So on the reduction in that period, that region would be greater, or will we be equalize that reduction, the same reduction up and down the coast for the specific time periods each state needs to put them in to accomplish that reduction. So that's what I'm looking at, where it's fair and equitable.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Tom. Anyone else with their hands up, Tony?
Chris Bat-Savage, Justin Davis, and Mike Armstrong.
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with the regional target, kind of regional closures as opposed to coastwide, with the thought of trying to reduce discard mortality during the hot summer months when the water temperatures are high. I think that's not going to be applicable coastwide. Be probably more in the Mid-Atlantic states down to North Carolina. I'm not sure about a target reduction. But maybe look at months, days, or waves, like wave 4 that's done up in Maryland, to focus the closure periods, and it would probably depend on the states as far as exactly when those dates would be. And as far as the type, it would definitely need to be no targeting and probably no harvest at the same time. Just no harvest will mean that people will go out and catch and release, and I don't think that's meeting the objective of what we're trying to do if we're really concerned about release mortality during when the water temperatures and air temperatures are high. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Dr. Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clarify, are you looking for comments at this point just on the first issue of geographic scope, or sort of the whole slate of things that are up here on the slide?
I prefer, I realize there's a relationship between these, but I prefer to keep them separate if we can do that, at least now at this stage.
Okay, fair enough. So on the issue of geographic scope, I think the only thing I could support would be regional closures. I think a coastwide closure, uniform up and down the coast, just doesn't make sense based on the migratory nature of the stock. There'd be no way to have sort of a equitable distribution of harvest or effort reduction up and down the coast with one size fits all coastwide closure. And I think going to the other extreme, a state by state closure, I think it leans into the weakness of the MRIP data. And I think it was also really clear from the Addendum 6 process and the discussion of conservation equivalency there that there was a pretty resounding rejection by the public and the board of the idea of moving towards patchwork state by state regulations for this species. So I think state by state closures opening up that possibility just starts to go down that road. And I don't think that's a place we want to go. So I think the only thing I could support would be regional closures.
Thanks, Justin. Mike Armstrong.
Yeah, as usual, I think this is way more complicated than it looks like on the surface. To me, if we're looking to decrease release mortality, and by nature that means we decrease the B2s, we have to have a no targeting closure. And I don't need to jump ahead, but that has ramifications. If we go with, we want to cut effort during a period when the discards are very high, which would be coastwide. There may in fact be a time, July, we're in Massachusetts and Maryland. They're both times when it's very, whole lot of discards. On the other hand, if we go with an environmental thing like temperature, then that by nature has to be state and regional. So I think there's another question that hasn't been addressed yet, and maybe we'll do it in the next blurb, is how do we want to do this? Is it get people off of catching fish, or get people off catching fish when it's so warm that mortality is very high? To me, that hasn't been decided, but I welcome anyone else's opinion, but I think we need to decide that. And clearly the effect is very different. I think as like maybe Chris noted, the effect in the mid-Atlantic with temperature guided things would be probably much greater than they were up north. So a whole nother thing to think about. So I'll just throw that out there.
I have Cherie Patterson and then John McMurray.
Cherie, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also agree with a state regional approach as opposed to a coastwide closures on several manners. We're dealing with a migratory species whose length of residency in any area is variable. We don't know from a coastwide perspective necessarily what other species are being targeted, where the striped bass might be a bycatch and we're still not achieving our effort controls that we are intended if we go through a coastwide closure. And I just think we have a better picture of objectives by the influence of states and regions being more familiar with when the striped bass are in those areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Cherie. John McMurray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple, I have one question and a comment. Have we gone down the road of establishing an overall target reduction with discards. And I think that's relevant to what we're talking about here. I'm not sure why we're trying to narrow it down at this point. For sure, I have an opinion about effort controls and state, regional, and coastal closures in particular. And of course, regional and state closures make more sense given the variability among states. I don't see any reason at this point to take any of these options out of the document. I think we need to see what some of these options might look like, and we need to hear from the public about them. So I know the PDT wants us to narrow this down, but in my opinion, we should include all options in the document at this point.
All right. Anyone else on the list, Tony?
That's all the hands.
Okay, so the majority of the speakers identified a preference for a regional approach, but I would note that I thought that the individuals talked about coastwide implications and concerns, made some valid points. So I think where we are as a board is we definitely want the regional strategy to be developed, but it also sounds like the board, at least some members of the board, want to keep some language in there about the coastwide issue. So without getting into the specifics of how the coastwide measure would work out at this stage. I mean, I think that's kind of where we are. I mean, we could keep both in, but the whole point of this exercise is to kind of narrow the range and focus the PDT work. So the board definitely wants regional closures in. Does anyone object to having a discussion of some of the points that were made about coastwide issues in the same document? Any objection?
We have an objection. Tom Fody has his hand up.
Yep. Justin?
Tom
Justin?
Fody.
Oh, Tom
It's Tom
Fody?
Fody.
Okay, Tom Fody?
I don't have an objection. What I'm basically saying is we already have a coastwide closure when we look at the EEZ. And it'd be interesting to get the public's comment on how they think that closure is working. I mean, a lot of us know that a whole bunch of catch and release fishery goes in the EEZ. They said they're not targeting, but we know they're targeting striped bass when they're out there because that's what's available, maybe occasional bluefish. So I'd like to hear from the public what they think about the coastwide closures.
Mr. Chair, Dennis Abbott, and then Megan Ware.
Dennis, and then Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the object this morning was to focus on what we wanted to do and probably to narrow down things. And it was clear to me that coastwide closures isn't something that would end up being in our final decision document, nor would it be accepted by the vast majority of the states. So I agree with John McMurray that, and I do personally believe that we should be as broad as can be in putting a document out. But at the same time, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that some things are not going to fly, and coastwide closures is definitely a non-starter, especially here in the Northern Range. I mean, I could have not envisioned, but think of the fact that New Hampshire have a closure in July, when that's about the, July and August is really the only time that we see fish. And as was previously stated in a migratory species, it makes a big difference to us. So a coastwide closure would, have a negative effect on our state, Massachusetts and Maine. So I just don't think that coastwide closures works, and I don't think it should go any further in the document. Thank you.
I've got Megan Ware next. Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I agree with Dennis Fair. I think the issue with the coastwide closure is there's equity issues kind of on both spectrums. So you could have a closure in the winter months, which is primarily that burden is going to be on the mid-Atlantic states, or you can have one in the summer. And that could take, 25% of the fishing opportunity in terms of time in some of the New England states. So I think there's kind of inequity potential on both sides of the spectrum. And so I think the way to best get around that is with more of a regional approach with a percent reduction.
You have Roy Miller followed by Pat Gear.
Roy and then Pat. Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing we haven't mentioned in regard to coastwide closures are spawning ground closures. Our practice has been historically, most if not all of the states have some type of spawning ground closure, but in many cases, like in the Delaware River, it is not a prohibition against targeting striped bass. If you're fishing catch and release, it's a prohibition on harvesting striped bass on the spawning grounds during the spawning season. So maybe that's something we might want to consider under the heading of coastwide closures, is additional clarification of what you can do on spawning grounds. Thank you.
Pat Gear.
Yes, I'm going to agree with Dennis on what he said. I think that having the PDT spend their time and efforts on developing any kind of options for coastwide closures, while we're saying that it's probably not going to go anywhere, it's not a good use of their time and effort. I'm more supportive of the state and regional closures, and having the PDT delve more into those to spend more time on that than looking at an option that, quite frankly, is probably not going to be approved by the states or even considered by the states.
That's all your hands, Mr. Chair.
Let me suggest is I think we have a consensus on this, not unanimous, to use the regional closure option. But I also would reiterate what I said before, that I think there should be dialogue developed around the coastwide issue to include some of the points that have just been made by various commissioners, so that is part of the document, and then we let the public comment on it. Is there any objection to doing that? Any hands up, Tony?
No hands.
Okay, so Emily, does that meet your requirement on that item?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I think we have some good feedback, and as was mentioned, the discussion on the next item will also help inform these options.
Okay, so on the next item, and Emily will introduce us, my own thinking on this is we just need a range of targets to put into it. It's more important to me to figure out how to do this and make it work than it is to reach a particular target. But I'm going to let Emily introduce the issue in greater detail if she wants, and then we'll take questions on it. Emily, you want to speak some more on this? Emily, do you have anything else to say on that item?
Yep, sorry, Mr. Chair, I was speaking into my muted microphone.
Oh.
So yes, just as a reminder, so without a specific percent reduction, it's difficult to develop specific closure options. So if the board does have a specific percent reduction in mind, that would be feedback for the PDT. If the board did not have a specific percent reduction in mind, the board could provide some guidance on times of the year, days, months, or waves the PDT should focus on. And then if there's no guidance on that, then the PDT would only focus on those biological or ecological closures, as was mentioned, such as spawning closures or closures based on temperatures.
So we're going to do comments. Any hands up?
We have Richie White.
Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that unless we hear a report from law enforcement saying that targeting closures are enforceable, I think that should not be part of this document, because I believe, especially in New England, it is not enforceable. There's no way of proving, if you have a wire leader on, that you're not blue fishing. In Maine, New Hampshire, Mass, probably Connecticut, and which makes targeting a striped bass. I mean, you can be targeting striped bass with a wire leader, and it would just not hold up in court. So anyway, I think that's a wasted effort. Thank you.
Tony, other hands up.
We have Justin Davis, followed by Mike Luisi.
Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, I mean, I guess these last two items here on the slide really do relate to each other, as Richie just alluded to. I share his concern about the prospect of a no targeting closure. I really worry that we'd be going down a road, again, sort of similar like to what we just went through with the circle hook mandate out of Addendum 6, where when we start to work on it, we realize that the degree to which that no targeting closure would be enforceable from jurisdiction to jurisdiction might vary quite a bit. And we could sort of be getting ourselves into a place where, due to the different regulatory scenarios in each state, the way each state's fisheries operate, it just really may not be tractable. I feel like if we're not talking about no targeting closures, then I'm not sure what we're doing here, because a no harvest closure to me does not really address the issue of recreational release mortality. If we close additional periods of time to harvest, we're not telling people they can't go out and catch and release striped bass. And if people go out and catch and release striped bass, potentially maybe catch and release more fish because they can't harvest and then switch to fishing to something else, we might be inadvertently increasing recreational release mortality with a no harvest closure. So to me, this just sort of relates as well as to this issue of what is our target. It's just not, it's not entirely clear to me here what we're trying to accomplish. I can understand the PDT's uneasiness with not sort of being given a clear goal of what we're actually trying to achieve here. And I don't think we have technical guidance that tells us what level of effort or discard reduction is necessary to achieve some goal related to ending overfishing or returning the stock out of an overfished state. Unlike Addendum 6, where we sort of had a clear target for removal reduction, this just seems to me like an effort to make an ad hoc move to address a specific source of mortality. And we could come up with ranges of days or months. I don't know how we explain to the public how we picked those ranges and how they relate to the overall goals we're trying to achieve, other than just a sense of, well, anything we can do to reduce removals and mortality can help rebuild the stock faster. But I don't know if this is really helpful input in terms of trying to decide where to go here, but I just really have concerns about generally what we're trying to achieve here. Also, given that the fishery is primarily catch and release and recreational, there will always be some level of discard mortality, and it's likely to be high in this fishery, just given the level of effort and that it's primarily catch and release. So I guess I don't really have any specific reduction target in mind. I don't know how to go about deciding what the appropriate target is, particularly if we're not talking about a no targeting closure, which I worry about really the feasibility of that. Thanks.
Mike Luisi.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I have to disagree with Richie on the no targeting closure. But I also want to say that I do agree with your comment regarding taking a look at a range of reduction options focused on minimizing release mortality. I mean, this is an issue that came up a couple years ago, and we all know the severity of release mortality as it relates to the stock health. I don't think we can't move forward with just a no harvest closure without, as Justin just mentioned, it's going to just translate into more catch and release, which is what we're trying to address here. So I think the no targeting closure is a must. It has to be in the document there. And you know, it's a new concept. We've been doing it for 2 years now. Not everybody's following the rules, I would imagine. We've talked with our enforcement agency, and they are doing their best to try to get people off fish when they see them catching stripers during the closure periods. But it's an evolution of understanding and behavior, and I think over time the no targeting closures will be much better understood. And if individuals are really interested in making sure that the striped bass stock is sustainable for the future, that they'll follow those rules. So I think it is a must for this document to have no targeting closures in place. But I do like your idea of a range of reductions, whether it's 10, 25, 50% from the release mortality that we know is a major issue in this fishery. I think those two in combination with each other should be combined and put together in an alternative that we can consider in the future. So I appreciate the time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have Bill Hyatt followed by Tom Foti.
Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just want to chime in that I am strongly opposed to no targeting closures. I think that they're broadly recognized as unenforceable. I think their reputation amongst our angling constituency is that they are a joke. And I think by considering them further and implementing them, that it reduces public confidence in virtually all that we do. So I would support strongly removing them from further consideration. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Tom Foti.
If you remove no targeting closures from the document, then why are we having harvest closures? I mean, truly, they're not the problem. We're basically controlling the amount of fish that are basically landed according to the percentages that we're reducing the catch by. What we're not reducing the catch by is the hook and release mortality. And what you said, it makes people have no confidence. Well, people have no confidence in harvest closures when they know that people out there and the people that are promoting that we should close the areas are the catch and release fishermen that are causing the problems as far as they're concerned. So there's the credibility problem. And I have a great difficulty in it. I mean, I look at what happens in the EEZ, and Mike, over the years, we've seen that the people just don't abide by, especially the catch and release fishermen, don't abide by the closures in the EEZ. They're out there fishing all the time. And these are the same people calling first to do closures in different areas because it's not going to affect them and their customers. But if you start basically doing closures in an area as far as harvest, you do affect certain captains that basically deal with people that want to take food home to eat, not just play with it.
That's all your hands.
All right, so lacking any direction, the PDT is going to focus on biological and ecological closures.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, you had a couple hands go up after I said you don't have any hands. And I'm going on your rule for those that have not spoken to this issue yet. Yeah. And so I have Marty Gary and John McMurray.
Marty?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I wanted to wait to hear a few folks, unlike the first time I commented. And I was glad I did. I don't want to protract this, but after listening, almost everybody was right. A prohibition on targeting is unenforceable. We have 2 law enforcement agencies that work with us on the Potomac, Maryland DNR and VMRC, and they pretty much told us on the public record at our meetings they can't enforce a no targeting. But despite that, our advisory committee and our commission were fully supportive of a no targeting prohibition when we implemented our Addendum 6 reductions with our closure. And part of that is this regional issue we have in the Chesapeake Bay with habitat compression when we have high water temperatures and high volumes of hypoxia. And basically, our situation in the Potomac, we can have a very low or no salinity. We had a freshet in 18 and 19 where we saw for great stretches of our tidal Potomac a near 0 salinity. So high temperatures, low salinity, I think everybody on this call knows what that means. And so it made perfect sense to implement that. And I think, the moral of the story for us was give the fish a break during this metabolically challenging time. But then when you get up into New England where, Richie and up in Maine and New Hampshire, you have salinity, you have cool water temperatures, I can see the paradox here. And I don't know that I'm offering you any kind of solution, but the targeting thing, I agree with Mike in the Chesapeake, it's a valuable tool, the no targeting rather, it's a valuable tool for us, but it may not be a great tool up in the Northeast and in the North. So I think we need to keep it in play. We clearly, I think, believe in the Chesapeake, it's a valuable tool. So I'll thank you for letting me speak at the end here.
Thanks, Marty. John McMurray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not opposed to keeping no target options in the amendment, because again, I think we need a full suite of options and the public needs to be able to comment on them. But let's not be naive on compliance here. It's 100% non-enforceable and people are going to fish for stripers no matter what. To Tom's point, of course, discards are a problem, regulatory discards and just straight up recreational discards. But to claim that they're the bigger issue is not correct. And I did want to point out that 52% of mortality is harvest and 48% is discards. And harvest is certainly the easier thing to control.
Mr. Chair, you have 1 repeat commissioner and 1 member of the public.
We're going to take the commissioner first.
Richie White.
Richie White, you get a second bite of maybe your first one, Rich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be short. Agree with the input that we're looking to lower mortality. Release mortality is certainly a big part of that, but a harvest closure would reduce mortality. So I think it's important to leave that in. Thank you.
All right, so we really don't have a consensus here on this. I guess my only suggestion is that on this specific issue, as I indicated before, without some kind of direction, the PDT will continue to focus on biological and ecological closures, but it seems to me that there's some merit in having the section on this in the document reflect the discussion that just took place about particularly the points that Marty raised about it may be an appropriate technique in some areas and not be an appropriate technique in other areas, and then seek the public's guidance on it. Would members feel comfortable with that? Any hands up, Tony?
Dave Sikorsky.
David?
Yeah, I'm just raising my hand to say yes, I'm comfortable with that.
Anyone else want to comment on that concept? So if there are any other hands up, Emily, does that help at all if we do that?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think so. There's been a lot of feedback on a couple different points. So I think, the PDT can, develop a couple different types of options. There seem to be more focus, as you mentioned, on the biological and ecological closures. So that's something the PDT can kind of focus on within this suite of options.
Emerson Hasbrook has his hand up.
Emerson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to say that I agree with your suggestion that you made a few minutes ago. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not going to take any public comments on this because this document in particular, this section of the document where we obviously have divergent views, is going to be further refined. Any member of the public that wants to weigh in has the option of talking directly to their own commissioners on this. And then we're going to have another bite at it at the next meeting. We'll see what was developed, and then if members of the public want to weigh in on that, they talk to their commissioners, and hopefully the commissioners bring the concerns to the table at that time. And we may also have opportunity for public comment. So without anything else at this stage, I'm going to move on to item 3, the type. Emily, do you have anything further on the type?
I don't. It sounded like there's already been a lot of discussion on this. Again, some divergent views with some not in favor of no targeting closures, some in favor of no targeting closures, and then maybe a few still in favor of no harvest closures.
Well, I guess my own view is that I think that if you do what Marty suggested, that's going to be fleshed out as part of this item and the previous item. The merits of the two strategies and the weaknesses will be fleshed out. Okay, so is there anything else? Anyone else want to speak on this issue? If not, Emily, could you advance the slide?
Joe Cimino.
Who? Tony, you broke up?
Sorry, Joe Cimino.
Joe, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just kind of wanted to take a step back to the comments about it isn't just about release mortality. I thought that's what this amendment was. I thought, and obviously this slide is, but I didn't know we were also targeting a reduction in fishing mortality again. I thought we did that last time around, and this amendment is specifically started to address release mortality, CE, and one other item, and management triggers. So I know we're going to get to the other two in a minute, but I don't understand why there were some comments that were very dismissive of release mortality just now and how to deal with it, and I'm kind of confused.
Anyone care to respond to that? Any
No
hands
hands.
up?
No hands.
Okay, so we're going to have to think on that, Joe, as we move along, maybe come back to it. Emily, could you advance the slide, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So moving us on to conservation equivalency, which is our next issue. So I'll again provide a little bit of background, and then there's a couple sets of questions for the board to consider. So again, just to recap, conservation equivalency provides flexibility for the states, but there are some challenges which were identified in the PID. And these challenges include regulatory inconsistency between neighboring states, the challenge of evaluating the effectiveness of CE programs, Also limited guidance on how and when CE should be pursued and how equivalency is defined. And then again, the challenge of the use of state level MRIP data, which is less precise than the regional or coastwide MRIP estimates. So the PDT is considering the following types of options to address these concerns about the use of CE. The PDT is thinking about the applicability of restrictions on CE, so which sectors would any CE restrictions apply to. The PDT is considering restrictions on when CE can be used, including options for restrictions that are based on stock status and options that would be based on specific justifications. The PDT is considering options around CE proposal requirements. So these types of options could include limiting the number or scope of proposals, setting some data standards for proposals, implementing or requiring an uncertainty buffer for proposals, and also defining equivalency. The PDT has also discussed probability of success metrics as well as CE accountability measures. And the requested guidance today on CE focuses on 5 main topics that are highlighted here. So we'll take these in sort of sets of 1 or 2 questions for the board to consider. So this is the first question that the PDT identified as sort of a starting point to inform the development of the CE options going forward. So the question for the board is whether the board can specify at this point which sector or sectors of the fishery would be subject to new restrictions on the use of conservation equivalency. So based on the PID and previous board meetings, most of the issues and concerns around CE seem to apply to non-quota managed recreational fisheries. So that would not include recreational bonus programs. However, the board has not decisively indicated whether new restrictions for CE would apply across the board to all sectors or would apply only to certain sectors. So it would be helpful if the board were able to specify which of these options the PDT would focus on. So the first option would be new restrictions on the use of CE would apply to recreational fisheries that are not managed by quota. So that would not include recreational bonus programs. The second option is new restrictions on the use of CE would apply to all recreational fisheries. So that would include the bonus programs. And the third option would be that new restrictions on the use of CE would apply to all recreational and commercial fisheries. The PDT included 2 notes in the memo. First, when comparing quota managed to non-quota managed fisheries and thinking about effectiveness, quota managed fisheries are accountable to a quota using census level harvest data, while non-quota managed fisheries rely on the survey-based harvest estimates to determine if they're exceeding a harvest target. And then second, thinking about regulatory consistency, the PDT notes that the commercial fishery will have variations both among and within states in terms of seasons, trip limits, et cetera, even without CE, because there are some pretty large differences in gear, participation, and quota by state across the commercial sector, even without CE. So with that, Mr. Chair, this might be a helpful place to pause for discussion before we move on to the rest of the questions about CE.
All right, comments from the board.
I have Megan Ware followed by Jay.
Megan?
Thank you. This is actually more of a question for Emily, but I guess I would agree with the PDT's assessment that generally the challenges we have seen have been with the recreational fisheries. I guess kind of a complicating factor here may be the fact that some states have been moving reductions between sectors in previous addendum, and I'm just curious if the PDT has discuss that and maybe potential implications, such that if one sector has more liberal CE requirements than another, if that could result in some situations that we either don't foresee or don't want.
Thanks for the question, Megan. If I'm remembering correctly, the PDT hasn't specifically discussed that. For example, thinking about Addendum 6 and, sort of spreading the reduction between two sectors. So that's not something the PDT has discussed, and that could be discussed, thinking about, in what scenarios, would it be difficult to sort of limit these restrictions to only part of the fishery. But yeah, that's something we can discuss.
Megan, you want to follow up?
Just to say that, yeah, I think that might be a helpful discussion for something the PDT to think through, because I do see that as a potentially complicating factor.
Okay, Tony, the second name?
Jason McNamee.
Jason. Dr. McNamee?
He's muted. Hold on, there we go.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So similar to Commissioner Ware, I have kind of a clarifying question. I too kind of take the point of, the group that potentially you could drop the commercial fisheries out of this. However, I think the best way for me to do this is to offer an example for the floating fish trap fishery in Rhode Island way back. We made an adjustment to the minimum size, and then through an analysis, translated that adjustment in minimum size to the quota. So again, it was eventually related back to the quota, and so that part of it, I think, is in line with what was in the presentation here. But I'm wondering if that is considered a conservation equivalency, and if so, that would be, a complicating factor. It would probably hinge around the minimum size by and large, and adjustments to that minimum size, because some of the commercial fisheries, in particular in the north, have larger minimum sizes. But that's my question, and I'm not sure if Emily is going to have an answer to that right now, but I just wanted to get that out on the table for consideration.
Emily?
Yeah, thanks for the question. One of the things that the PDT did discuss is that it would be helpful to develop for the draft amendment a list of current CE programs that are in place, just to get a better idea of, exactly, thinking about exactly where these restrictions on CE would apply. So that, I think that could kind of fall into that discussion of making it clear to the board and to the public what is currently implemented through CE to better be able to address this question.
Jason, you want to follow up?
Nope, I'm perfectly fine with that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Tony, who else do you have on the list?
I currently don't have any hands up.
I'm not sure that we've provided enough guidance on this. But if people don't have specific suggestions, we can come back to it. So I'll just make a note that we'll come back to it. Individuals can think about the discussion and the issues, and we'll come back and give you another round of opportunity to comment on it.
I just got two more hands, Mike Luisi and Dennis Abbott.
Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. If you're looking for a direct recommendation, my recommendation would be to focus on option 3 here and allow for both recreational and commercial fisheries to be included in the conservation equivalency programs. We just had a conversation about states, and everything's a little, all states are different, and we might need to make adjustments as needed within that state. And I think excluding commercial fisheries in the conservation equivalency program would be a mistake. I would like to see how option 3 would be developed to allow for both recreational and commercial fisheries to be included in those CE programs. So if you're looking for direct input, that's my input, and we'll see what others have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. That was helpful. Dennis?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just sitting here thinking that we're dealing with conservation equivalency striped bass. Would the results of this lead us to apply the same regulations, or whatever you want to call them, to all species that we manage? How would we consider that? Kind of an off-the-wall question, but.
Well, it's a question that's probably beyond the scope of the board's authority to debate. You might want to raise that at a policy board meeting. Anyone else on the list?
Mr. Chair, this is Emily. I just have a quick clarification. So this, just to clarify, the PDT is not necessarily looking for input on which sectors would be permitted or would be able to use CE. This question is more focused on which sectors would be subject to these potential new restrictions on the use of CE. So, for example, if the board, was looking at options that would limit the types of proposals that could be submitted, would that sort of restriction apply to all CE programs across the commercial and recreational sectors, or would those types of restrictions only apply to the recreational sector? Given that that's where a lot of these concerns about CE sort of originate. So I just wanted to clarify that this question is focused on which sectors would be subject to restrictions on the use of CE, and not which sectors would be able to use CE at all.
Comments?
I have Richie White.
Richie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support all sectors. Thank you.
Thanks, Richie. Anyone else?
Just giving people a moment. Right now, I don't have any hands.
Okay, so we've got some input on those points. Emily, if you'd like to move on.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
And Mike Luisi suggested number 3. So if somebody feels a compelling need to come back to that, we can come back to that at the end. So Emily, if you would advance the dialogue, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the next question is related to restricting conservation equivalency based on justification. So for example, a justification could be limited, or a justification could include biological reasons, such as the size, availability of fish in an area being smaller than what the coastwide measure stipulates. So the idea here is that conservation equivalency would be limited to times when a real hardship would occur due to the implementation of the FMP standard. So the question for the board is, how does the board want to proceed with these types of options for restricting CE based on justification? And the PDT could identify general justification categories. For example, CE could be used if there's a biological reason, or if there's a reason related to fair and equitable access. But the PDT is concerned that these sort of general justification categories may not provide enough guidance, and then most requested conservation equivalency plans would qualify under these general categories. And the other option is the PDT could develop specific justification categories. So for example, specifying what types of biological reasons would justify using CE. And this would provide more guidance, but this might result in a valid reason potentially being left out of the amendment document. So that's one question, and I'll go through one more question, and then we can sort of address two questions at once here. So then the next question for the board is related to the number of alternatives in conservation equivalency proposals. So the board had previously requested options that would restrict the number of management alternatives that a state could submit within a CE proposal. And the PDT recognizes the challenges that are caused by the high number of alternatives, for example, submitted as part of the Addendum 6 process. However, the PDT also identified some challenges in situations where a larger number of alternatives might be necessary. So first, if the timing of the CE proposal deadline is before a state's public comment or regulatory process, a larger number of alternatives might be needed in anticipation of public hearings. Another situation might be if states are trying to coordinate with neighboring states, then more alternatives might be needed for their proposal, again, making it challenging to restrict the number of alternatives a state could submit. And then finally, thinking about management complexity, states with multiple fishery components, for example, different seasons or different areas, might need more flexibility on the number of alternatives based on that complexity. So the question to the board here is that thinking about these administrative challenges with limiting the number of alternatives a state could submit, does the board still want the PDT to pursue options for specific number limitations? And if so, if the board would like to see a hard cap on the number of alternatives a state would be allowed to submit, what would that number be? So Mr. Chair, here I've pulled up these last two questions. If you'd like to take discussion on these.
Thanks, Emily. Did the question from the chair, did the PDT discuss having an arrangement where we'd have a cap, and I'll just pick one arbitrarily, 3 or 4 options with some kind of provision in the document for an exception? So if a state had some compelling reason, they could appeal directly to the board, and then the board could grant them an exception to exceed whatever number gets selected. Was that concept discussed?
The PDT hasn't specifically discussed exceptions, although we are considering options where potentially for each management action, either the board or the TC could put some bounds on the types of proposals that could be submitted. So for example, maybe for a certain management action, the board could say, we won't see any alternatives with a size limit greater than X. So the PDT is considering those types of options that would sort of provide that flexibility within the amendment. But we haven't talked about a specific cap with an exception.
Okay, and then the follow-up would be, have we, well, actually, I'm going to skip the question. So let me go to the board and see whether or not the board wants to weigh in. Comments? Hands up, Tony?
Yep, I'll start with the first 2 names I saw, Jason McMee and Roy Miller, and then I'll give you more after that.
Jason and then Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple of comments here. Again, I really appreciate the presentation and the information provided. And, I think, so I'll start with the first one, and that's on justification. I think it would be extremely difficult for us to come up with. So the only way to do this, I'm in agreement, is to define specific criteria for the justification categories. And I just don't see us being able to do that in a really comprehensive way through this document. And I can, with high probability, say that the very first one we get would have a justification that didn't fall into one of our categories, but that we all thought was legitimate, and we'd end up in kind of a tough spot as a board. So I don't think we really need to define justification. I think the technical committee, upon their review, they give us hints. Sometimes they give us very overt comments about, what they think about any particular justification. Some recent ones where I think we've gone a little askew is on like circle hooks and assigning a specific value to the reduction achieved in mortality. Like things like that is where we start to get outside of the bounds of what we can actually quantify. And so, I think we can make those types of judgments as a board. We need to step up a little bit and be a little more bold to say, look, we're not accepting that as a justification. But to try and define all of the possible justifications here in this document, I don't think we should do that. And then quickly on the number, I know this is another area I think, it becomes a talking point of, oh my God, that so-and-so submitted 50 proposals, when really what they submitted was, variations of a single method. I don't think I've ever seen a situation where there was even more than 3 or 4 different methods that were proposed by a single state. I don't think states have the resources to produce more than that. So putting an arbitrary cap on the number of CEs that can be submitted, I don't think that's valuable either. And again, I think we shouldn't require a state to put forward the full continuum of possibilities within a single method. It should be the method that they're giving to the technical committee, and then 1 or 2 just to kind of show the range of what they're thinking about, but we don't need the full continuum. So I guess what I'm suggesting is I don't think we need either of these in the document.
Thanks, Jason. Roy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to agree pretty much with what Jason said. With regard to the second question there, a hard cap, I think it's too difficult to set a hard cap in advance. I think as a general recommendation, none of us like to review a whole multitude of options from a particular state. I think that could be, the number of options could be winnowed down at the state level before submission to the board, rather than throw a whole number of options up there and see which ones stick. That should be done at the state level. So I think just a general recommendation that states should make every attempt to limit the number of options proposed before submitting to ASMSC would be sufficient in this case. I don't think we need a hard cap. Thank you.
Other comments? That sounds like we got 2 individuals in agreement. General justification with no cap. Tony?
Yep. I have, for people who have kept their hands up, I have Justin Davis, followed by Joe Cimino, Eric Reed, and Richie White.
Justin and then Joe, and I'll go back to Tony on the names.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the thoughtful comments from Dr. McNamee and Roy Miller. I feel like my support for having specific justification categories and potentially looking at a hard cap was my experience in the Addendum 6 process, where I thought sort of the overwhelming number of CE proposals that got submitted created substantial challenges for those folks on the technical committee to effectively vet them before the board had to take action. And I think also led to a really long and drawn out board meeting. I guess I'm really hesitant to go back to a situation where we just stay with the status quo and just hope that won't happen again. I do think potentially trying to provide some options for specific justification categories in the document could help focus the discussion a bit on what people think are the appropriate justifications for using conservation equivalency. It was my impression during the Addendum 6 process that many jurisdictions didn't even offer any justification for why they were pursuing conservation equivalency. It was just sort of understood that every state was going to go ahead and do that because the option was available. I don't know that for this species and this management program, we want to have a situation where the default expectation is once we settle on a coastwide standard, every state takes a look to see if they want to do something different, just to see if they can to provide something that's a little bit better for their fishery. So I feel like I would like to see some pursuit of development of specific justification categories. And on the hard cap, I get that it could be tough to set an arbitrary number, but I wonder if it's possible to go back and look at the last few management document processes we've been through and look at the number of proposals that were submitted. And it may be possible in looking at that there's some cap we could identify that wouldn't have limited, 80 or 90% of instances of proposals being submitted, but maybe there's a few sort of outliers where we might say, yeah, that's too many, and a cap sort of in between makes sense. So those are my thoughts on the topic. Thanks.
Yep. So Justin, you're basically recommending on the cap that the technical people do an analysis and look at the history and then calculate some percentages that would generate some numbers, a cap that would generate a percentage reduction. So we could look at it and look at actual history and make a determination. Is there any objection to doing that? Because I think that would further the dialogue on the cap. Any objection to doing that? So Emily, that's a task under that issue. So let's focus on the general justification versus the specific justification. I've got Joe Cimino.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I agree with everything that Jason said on this, and to that end, one part of that is at odds with what Justin suggested, and that's that there were some overwhelming number of choices that would have made it difficult for the TC to review. If this was fluke or sea bass, we wouldn't have seen those huge tables with options because the methodology would have been approved and it would have boiled down to what was probably just a couple of options for the states. And so, I think that needs to be given some consideration. We manage other species where conservation equivalency is used constantly, and the methodology is approved so that if you're shifting 2 to 3 days or a week within a wave, it wouldn't have to result in a table full of options. It'd simply be a single option. And I think that should have been something that was given more consideration and discussion for this. And now we have a new amendment to do just that. So I think that's something that we should be looking at as we move forward.
Thanks, Joe. Tony, the next two names, please.
Eric Reed, then Richie White.
Eric and then Richie.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a general question about CEs in general. Is that okay to put it in at this point?
Certainly.
Okay, thanks. So, CE is a mechanism. It's actually a tool, a luxury to avoid hardship. We've had discussions about the probability of success, uncertainty buffers, depending on MRIP, etc. So my question is it possible to require any CE proposal to exceed whatever the target release mortality, rec mortality, mortality in general, by X percent? If it's 20%, you have to exceed it by 10%. That makes it 22. Make it 20%, it's 24. Because of the uncertainty, it's a luxury, and in my mind, you won't have to pay for a luxury. So that's my question: can we require it to be more restrictive than the coastwide target in general?
Emily, do you want to speak to that point?
Yes, and thanks for the question. So the PDT is considering that type of option under the this category of uncertainty buffer under the CE proposal requirements. So the PDT is looking at options that would require CE proposals to exceed the required reduction as a potential option for the draft amendment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I request an option that requires CE to be submitted as part of the management document, so addendum or amendment, so that the public gets to see them and the public gets to comment on them. I think what's caused a lot of problems is that the board selects a set of regulations, public comments on that, then after the fact, the CEs come in and the public never really have a chance across the board to comment. So you have regulations changing in abutting jurisdictions, and the general public never got a chance to comment on those. So that's my request, to allow the public to comment on an option that requires the CEs to be part of the document that goes out to the public. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, just to respond to Richie's request, if we did that, that would mean every time conservation equivalency was being contemplated, we would have to do an addendum. Sometimes conservation equivalency is asked by a state and we don't have an addendum process going on. And in addition, it would slow down the addendum process probably by 3 to 6 months, because we get the management options out first and then immediately go into the process, and we would need the states to come back and give us all of their proposals immediately. So I'm just, we can put that in the document, but I just want to control that expectation.
Follow up, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Richie, follow up.
Yeah, thank you. I think having that in this option, explain those things is fine. But I think the public gave us a pretty strong message on conservation equivalencies. And I think that it's important to allow the public to comment on all aspects of how this process works. And I think this is an important one to see if they think it's very important that they be part of the final process of approving a conservation equivalency. Thank you.
All right. Any other comments on this?
You're Mike Luisi, followed by Tom Foti.
Mike, and then Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make a comment regarding Mr. Reed's comments about conservation equivalency and the certainty and, or I guess, uncertainty of how it compares with the coastwide alternative. And I would say that there's uncertainty in both. I don't necessarily know that when a coastwide alternative is proposed through the development of an amendment or an addendum, that there's any more certainty that those measures are going to provide for the reductions needed than a conservation equivalency document. So, you know, I think if we're going to go down that road of looking at the certainty of conservation equivalency proposals, there should be some analysis of where that certainty lies within the coastwide alternative as well. Because you know, having worked with my staff, you know, within our agency on developing some of these alternatives, there's just as much uncertainty as to how they will work as the conservation equivalency programs. And I'll stop there and leave it there. I do agree, and while I have the mic, I do agree with Dr. McNamee. I think we should leave this conservation equivalency kind of open in general, and I don't necessarily know that we should use a hard cap on the number of specific proposals that go forward. You know, within the states, we sometimes start with a large number and we whittle it down to the best we can. And I think, you know, I think the states should take that upon themselves to try to put forth something that's actually realistic to the technical committee for review, rather than sending them 20 options for review when they know that, you know, 18 of those options aren't going to be workable. So I do agree with Jason and others that spoke in favor of the comments he made, and I appreciate the time. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Tom Foti.
Yeah, I agree with Mike and what Jason said. I also don't understand what Richie's talking about. When you do conservation equivalency, it's for your state. It's not how other states look at it. It's you're accomplishing a reduction according to the conservation equivalency. And that might have a different size than you have in a different state, but it's still doing the same method. We're taking a shorter season. And all they look at a certain part of the regulation, well, they're taking a smaller fish like Chesapeake Bay. And all of a sudden we have other states from the north saying that's not what they should be doing with Chesapeake Bay because we don't like that size limit. Richie, that's not practical what you're talking about. First of all, the time involved. Most of the time you go to a public hearing in your state and you put the conservation equivalency. That's one of the reasons you ask for a list of options, is because you take it to the public in your state and say what option to accomplish this reduction you want in our state. And that's what basically how it works. That's how it works for years.
All right, so we've had a number of good suggestions here. Seems like there's a consensus not to put a cap on the number. And I think if I'm reading the comments correctly, the group wants to, majority of the individuals that have spoken want to stick with the general justification. Anything else on this?
Mr. Chair, I have one repeat, Justin Davis.
Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to note quickly, even though I am in favor of the specific justification categories and the cap, I don't feel strongly enough about it that I would want the PDT to do that work based on just my comments earlier. It's apparent to me, as you noted, that the majority is in favor of general justification categories and not considering a cap, and I'm fine with that.
Thank you very much, Justin. Emily, you want to move on?
Sounds good. Thanks, Mr. Chair. We just have one more set of questions for CE. So the final two questions for consideration for conservation equivalency are about probability of success and accountability measures. So for the probability of success, the PDT recognized that there is board and public interest in considering a probability of success metric for CE proposals. But after some discussion, the PDT does not recommend pursuing a probability of success metric for CE proposals. And this is primarily because a probability of success metric is not available and can't be calculated at the state level. So while it would be possible to calculate coast-wide the probability of success, for example, of achieving the fishing mortality target for all different combinations of CE proposals that are submitted, that would add considerable time and complexity to the process. So for example, if states submitted several different CE proposals, and with all the combined CE proposals, there was a lower probability of success of achieving the fishing mortality target, then the question would become which states would have to change their proposals and by how much would they have to change them. So again, at this point, the PDT does not recommend pursuing a probability of success metric for CE proposals.
Emily, just real quick, your slides, they're not moving forward, just as a FYI.
Thank you, Joni.
No worries. Thanks.
All right, well, Emily is adjusting that. You've heard the recommendation. Any comments? Tony, do we have any comments? Hands up.
Wait, Richie White?
Richie.
And then followed by Megan Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I don't understand this, because if we cannot determine probability of success, then how are we approving conservation equivalent proposals? It seems like what we're being told is we don't know if they're going to work or not. Is that, am I not seeing this correctly?
Emily,
Right.
or somebody on the staff?
Right, so the way that the model is set up to quantify that uncertainty around achieving the F target and the spawning stock biomass, that uncertainty can be quantified at a coast-wide level, but we can't quantify that at a state level. So therefore, we can't calculate a probability of success for a specific CE proposal. And I'm gonna phone a friend here and see if Katie can add anything to help address your comment.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to kind of how we can't quantify the major sources of uncertainty that are causing both the coast-wide measures and the conservation equivalency measures to succeed or fail. So when we tell you, we need this level of removals to have a 50% chance of being at the F target in 2020, the uncertainty around that is really coming from the stock assessment model that has uncertainty in, what is the population size when we start these projections? What is recruitment going to be like in the next couple of years? And so we can say, if we achieve this level of reduction, then we'll have this probability of success based on the uncertainty in sort of stock status and where the population is at and where it's going to be. But we don't really have a way to say, what is effort going to be like in 2020? That's one of the major drivers of uncertainty in these conservation equivalencies, and also the bag and size limit analyses that we do for the overall coast-wide measure. So we can't say, going up to this changing the size limit will have an X% probability of giving you this reduction, because we don't know what effort's going to be like. We can roughly approximate the size structure and the availability of fish in a couple of years, but we don't know for sure what that's going to be like, and we really can't quantify the uncertainty around it. So we can't give you a hard probability of success or failure. And I will also say we don't give you a hard probability of achieving that. We don't say this coast-wide measure is going to have an X% chance of giving you the reduction. We say if we meet our assumptions about effort and size availability of fish, we'll get this level of reduction, which translates into a probability of success at the assessment level. We can't say, that this conservation equivalency measure is going to has a 50% chance of giving you an 18% reduction, because we can't really quantify those major drivers of uncertainty. I think we could give you a better handle on some of the uncertainty for both the coast-wide and the conservation equivalency measures, but we don't have hard quantifiable ways to give you what's the probability that this change in management will give you the change in removals that you're expecting.
Follow up, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, go ahead, Richie.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. And as a result of that answer, I certainly support Eric Reed's earlier suggestion that we have options that require, say, 110, 125% of the requirement as a buffer, as an uncertainty buffer. So I think that's important that we have options such as that for the public.
Yeah, as was indicated, Richie, those are already being developed. Next on the list, I have Megan.
Thanks. Yeah, I think maybe my comment gets to where Richie's comment got, but I was definitely kind of bummed to see that this isn't possible, because I thought it might be a way to hold CE proposals to a certain % probability of success. But I do think, if it's not possible and it gets removed, it does put more pressure or onus on something like an uncertainty buffer as a way to counteract some of that uncertainty that we can't quantify. So I look forward to seeing those options.
The next two names I have are Jason McNamee and then Dennis Abbott, and then I'll have some more names.
Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Interestingly, I think our previous discussions on this topic, I felt were kind of veering off into this notion of like punitive accountability, which I didn't think was the right way to go, because there's so many variables here that aren't in a state's control. And I really appreciated Commissioner White and Dr. Drew's discussion there a moment ago. I think, so I agree with what Dr. Drew said, but I will kind of harken back to what Mr. Reed said during the last discussion. While we can't necessarily define probabilities of success for the reasons, I think we could, but those tools need to be developed. We're working on some stuff like that for fluke scup black sea bass right now. But in the absence of that, in the short term, what you can do is apply precautionary buffers, as Eric suggested earlier, and that is to say, you're trying to achieve some level of reduction, and we want you to go 10% more than that, because we have uncertainty that this will be successful. I think we can probably borrow, we don't need to make that up out of whole cloth right now. We can probably borrow from the risk and uncertainty process that's also being developed by the Commission right now. It's not ready for straight bass yet, but eventually I hope it will get around to straight bass. And I think some of the inputs for the risk and uncertainty decision tree could be useful in this context. But I think in the short term, that is something that we could pursue in this process. It's tractable, and that is to just add a precautionary buffer, of some level. Probably working in proportions is the smartest way to, or the easiest way to go. Thanks.
Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have been enjoying this conversation immensely. I have a layman's hypothetical question for Katie. Nothing that I would really suggest, but hypothetically, if New Hampshire proposed a conservation equivalency of a 12-inch or 16-inch minimum size limit, and that was given to the technical committee, and you calculated that coast-wide, could New Hampshire's request for a very low size limit be accepted?
So I think it would depend on, so if we said, if we put in a 12-inch size limit, and that met the 18% reduction that we needed, would that qualify for a conservation equivalency approval at the TC level? And so I think it would depend on what kind of standards the TC is using to review that analysis. And right now, I think, the focus is on, are you meeting that reduction in removals that we are expecting? I think the question of, does that affect how would that impact, say, long-term SPR of the stock is certainly a different question. And I think that's maybe something that the TC would flag as a concern in terms of, you may be meeting the spirit of the law of the reduction, but are you meeting the spirit of the reduction in terms of preventing negative impacts to the overall stock? So I think that's kind of, it comes down to, which maybe falls under something like the biological justification of why you're asking for this versus the TC's biological justification for approving or not approving a CE proposal. So I think it's definitely would be something that the TC would discuss, but I don't think we have hard and fast rules about what meets the spirit versus the letter of a conservation equivalency proposal.
Just follow up, Mr. Chair.
Yep, briefly, Dennis, I want to move on.
Yeah, thank you. But again, Katie, are we required to comply with the spirit, or are we required to comply with the law?
It's I think we would take that information to the board and say, here is the conservation equivalency proposal. It meets the spirit of the reduction, but the TC has concerns about the potential impact on spawning potential in the future. How does the board want to deal with this? The board is the one in the end who approves or disapproves conservation equivalency. The TC can help provide the technical guidance on whether this meets the reduction, whether this meets the intent of the regulations that you are trying to be equivalent to, but it is the board in the end who decides whether or not that proposal is approved.
Thank you, Katie.
All right, Emily, let's move on.
You had a couple other hands. Do you let me know what you want to do?
For the individuals, if there's an individual with a hand up that wants to make a point that has not been made, I'll recognize you. So who are the two individuals?
I have Joe Cimino and Bill Hyatt with their hands still up.
Okay, so Joe and Bill, I'd just soon not get into a repetitive dialogue on this. If there's something new, by all means, bring it forward. Joe?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm just curious, and so it's a question maybe to Katie. What would be used to determine if something is more uncertain? A state like New Jersey has fairly low PSEs for striped bass. I mean, I'm assuming that PSEs have to play a role. Is there some other way to say that a single state's proposal is less uncertain than a region when that state may have lower PSEs and higher harvest than an entire region?
So for sure, some of that, is stuff that we can quantify. So for example, PSEs, not just, maybe your PSE is good for your whole state, but once you start breaking it down into wave or into sector or into region, you're going to increase those PSEs and you're going to have a more uncertain proposal compared to the coast-wide data that we're using to develop the coast-wide measures. So that stuff we can quantify, PSEs at the regional versus the state versus the wave or mode level. But other stuff about, how is effort going to change in New Jersey compared to how it's going to change overall on the coast, that's difficult to quantify. And similarly, how is availability of fish in New Jersey water is going to compare to coastwide availability or size structure of the entire population. That's another additional source of uncertainty that's going to feed into whether or not you can make your required reduction that we don't have a good way to quantify at the moment.
Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I apologize if this is slightly repetitive. I lost connection for a good period of the last discussion. I was going to speak in favor of the uncertainty buffer and the concept. I was hoping, however, that in setting those uncertainty buffers, it wouldn't be just sort of the selection of arbitrary percentages, that rather there could be an analysis performed based upon the precision of NRIP samples and the conservation equivalency proposals being put forward, that could sort of refine what is an acceptable uncertainty buffer and what is unacceptable. I also was hoping that the analysis could identify in certain cases whether or not a state would have the option of increasing its commitment to MRIP funding additional MRIP sampling within its borders to therefore make a conservation equivalency proposal meet fall within a specified uncertainty buffer. But I guess part of what I was hearing, I'm questioning whether or not those concepts are even possible. So recognizing that I might have missed some relevant discussion on that, just a real quick answer from Katie would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, Katie, if you'd like to offer some thoughts, and I just reinforce what I said before. You're going to get another bite of this at the next meeting. There's going to be more detail on this. But Katie?
I think, we could, I guess it depends on how much work you want the TC to do on this particular issue. I think, sure, theoretically, we could develop uncertainty buffers based on, for example, a management strategy evaluation to say, this level of uncertainty around the reductions translates into this level of ability to hit the target. But without like a full simulation study on that, we don't have a way to quantify what the right level of an uncertainty buffer is at the moment. I think it comes back to sort of risk and uncertainty tolerance for the board, as Dr. McNamee was alluding to. And I think similarly, we could certainly provide maybe tiers of buffers to say, if your PSEs are in this range, then you have to have this level of a buffer. If your PSEs are in a better range, then you can have a lower buffer. Or, if you're trying to do a regional proposal with a group of a couple of states, you can have a different buffer. And so, we could provide tiers of buffers, but it wouldn't necessarily be like, this is the exact right number to give you this exact probability of rebuilding the stock in 10 years. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I think there's ways forward, and we can provide different levels of input on that, but there still remains a lot of unquantified uncertainty in these analyses. And as for the question of, would states have to, or could we require states to increase MRIP sampling in order to move them down to a different buffer, or to accept a conservation equivalency proposal? I think that's certainly something the board can discuss as a potential option to make conservation equivalency more aggressive or more restrictive.
Thanks, Katie. Emily, we're going to move on.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the final question for conservation equivalency is related to accountability. So again, based on board interest, the PDT has discussed options that could require accountability measures for those instances when a state's harvest or catch under a CE program exceeds its target, or in other words, if a state CE program does not achieve the required reduction. And these accountability measures could be, for example, a requirement to revert to the FMP standards, or it could be a requirement to implement additional measures estimated to achieve the target. However, after some discussion, the PDT recommends removing these types of options for accountability from consideration in the draft amendment. And the PDT really emphasizes here the challenges with evaluating the performance of CE. Again, this was discussed earlier in the FMP review agenda item as well. The effects of implementing any management measures can't be isolated from the effects of changes in effort or changes in fish availability. And the PDT is also concerned about potentially the amount of time the board could spend on CE in the future if accountability measures are required. And from the PDT's perspective, these other front-end measures that we've been discussing, like restrictions on when conservation equivalency can be used, requirements for CE proposals, for example, these uncertainty buffers and data standards, would be more effective than having accountability requirements for CE. So again, the PDT is recommending removing these accountability measures from consideration. And just related to that, we had a request from a board member to evaluate the performance of CE. And again, as just discussed, the PDT does not consider this performance analysis to be feasible, again, due to these influences of changes in effort, fish availability, and year class strength. So just to wrap up, Mr. Chair, we covered this first recommendation already, but the final question for the board on CE is, does the board support the PDT's recommendation to remove accountability from consideration?
Thanks, Emily. Comments? Any hands, Tony?
First two names, Mike Luisi and Jason McNamee.
Mike and then Jason.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will say that I fully support the PDT's recommendation for removing conservation equivalency accountability options from consideration due to the challenges that were just presented by Emily. Based on my previous comments regarding uncertainties surrounding not only the conservation equivalency programs that are developed, but the coastwide measures as well, I feel that holding a state accountable in a different way if they don't implement the coastwide measure because of certain reasons, and they come up with a solid plan to make sure that they are trying the best that they can to manage the reductions to the point for which they be compliant with the FMP. I don't think that those states that put conservation equivalency proposals together should be held at a different level of accountability. We're all professionals. We're all trying to do the right thing, and I do agree with the PDT's recommendation. So I'll leave it there, and thank you for the time.
Thanks, Mike. Dr. McNamee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This one's tough because it's hard to say you're not for accountability. I think accountability is great. I think the accountability should happen on the front end in what we were discussing in the last section. So applying precautionary buffers before implementing management, that sort of thing. You know, for the reasons the PDT noted, I'm in agreement on this one. I think, you know, I just think I think folks, you know, all of us are subject to potential statistical anomalies. And that's what we are using for this fishery, the vast majority of this fishery. And so, you know, that's a hard thing to hold yourself accountable to. I really liked Commissioner Hyatt's comment, this sort of incentive to increase MRIP sampling. That I like that, if that can be worked in to the mix here somehow. I think that helps the cause, but in the end, you know, any one of us, any state listening in right now, you could be subject to some statistical anomaly in any given year due in no fault of your management or your fishermen or the fish themselves. And so I just, what we should be working towards is being precautionary as we implement management, not on the back end after the management has been implemented. Thanks.
Me?
Yep, you have Justin Davis followed by Dennis Abbott.
All right, Justin, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can also support the PDT's recommendation here. I think I would want to assure those members of the public who have strong interest in seeing greater accountability for CE that I think what we're doing here is listening to the PDT and what they're telling us about the best possible option to create some sort of guardrails or greater accountability for CE. The best option is to do that on the front end, not to try to do accountability on the back end. I think a lot of times this interest from the public in accountability stems from instances in which, there's a perception that CE proposals did not produce the projected outcome. And sometimes the public wants to get into assigning fault over that or motive. I don't think that's really productive. As Dr. McNamee was noting, statistical anomalies can affect any state. They can affect a state if you implement the standard coast-wide measure. So I think the PDT has made a good recommendation here to pursue front-end options to provide some more guardrails on CE, and that's where we should focus. One sort of note, this builds a little bit off of what Dr. McNamee was saying, that I also like the idea of this sort of potential requirement for a state pursuing CE to do a little bit more MRIP sampling or some sort of sampling to improve, recreational data collection, providing some incentive there. I think that option fell under the CE accountability section in the document, and I'm hoping that's not going to get sort of thrown out here if we remove CE accountability options. So I would just advocate for trying to keep that in the document, keep it in the discussion somehow. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Justin. We got 3 in agreement. Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I fully believe in accountability in everything that we do in our life. And I would like to see accountability here. However, I agree with Jason McNamee that it's not possible practically in fisheries to determine accountability from year to year. Therefore, I think that the rigor on the front end, as previous speakers have mentioned, should be very strong. And as Eric Reed said, I think earlier, there's a luxury to what's CE, and you should really be looking to pay a price up front before you are granted conservation equivalency. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 4 in agreement. Somebody want to raise their hand if they want to speak in opposition to what has been said? Is there anybody that wants to speak in opposition? Otherwise, I think we have a consensus.
I see no hands.
No hands. I think we have a consensus on the issue. Has anyone got anything new to add on this that was not stated? I'll recognize you.
Megan Ware, and that's it.
Megan.
Mr. Chair, my comment is just about CE in general and potentially another option, not about accountability. So I can hold that or say it now.
No, you can do it now.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'm wondering if it's possible to have an option either in this document, or Tony, you can let me know, or Emily, if this is more appropriate for like a policy board discussion about general CE procedures. But we've had a state change their CE closure from what they presented, and I really appreciate Mike providing that figure, because I think it provides a lot of rationale for why Maryland made their change. But I think it is appropriate for a state to notify the board if they're going to change their CE measures, ahead of that change being finalized in state regulation. So I don't know if that is something that can be added into this document, but it just kind of it notifies the board, and it makes sure that people don't feel caught off guard kind of after something has already happened.
Megan, that is already part of the procedures and is one of the reasons why the plan review team pointed it out to the board. So it is something that is supposed to happen.
Okay, thank you, Tony. I'll just highlight that in the future. That would be great for states to follow. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Emily, we're going to move on.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'm just moving on here to the last bit of this Amendment 7 presentation, and it's related to the management triggers. Again, as outlined in the PID, there are some shortfalls with the triggers that have been identified. Again, sort of the variable nature of fishing mortality and continued need for management action. The board had the desire for management stability, and there's some uncertainty with using point estimates. Also some concern about making changes to management before the stock has a chance to respond to previous management measures. And then for the recruitment trigger, there have been these longer periods of below average recruitment, and there's some question about the performance of the current recruitment trigger. So to account for all the different combinations of management trigger methods and timeframes, the PDT is looking at 4 tiers for the management triggers. So the first tier will outline a set of alternatives for the fishing mortality triggers. The second tier will outline alternatives for the spawning stock biomass triggers. The third tier will outline options for the recruitment trigger. And the fourth tier will outline options for deferring management action. So those options would, for example, if a management trigger was tripped within a certain number of years and some other criteria are met around spawning stock biomass, the board could consider options for deferring management action. So then within each tier, there will be some options for the board to consider. And as Mr. Chair mentioned, we'll see these in more detail in the draft document. But just as an example, again, for the fishing mortality triggers, there's a set of alternatives thinking about the timeline to reduce fishing mortality to the target, a set of alternatives looking at the F threshold triggers, and a set of alternatives looking at the F target triggers. And then for the spawning stock biomass triggers, there will be a set of alternatives looking at a potential deadline to implement a rebuilding plan, a set for the spawning stock biomass threshold trigger, and then also a set for the spawning stock biomass target trigger. And the PDT is working to more fully develop these options for the next board meeting. We did get a request from a board member that any newly proposed triggers be tested to evaluate their performance. So asking that question of how would different triggers have performed in the past. And the PDT did discuss this, the TC did as well, and the PDT does not recommend conducting this retrospective analysis at this time because the stock assessment, the reference points have changed over time. There have been updates to the assessment model, and our understanding of stock status have changed over time. It would be difficult to know how the stock would have responded if different triggers were in place that maybe led to different management actions. And the TC also pointed out that a full management strategy evaluation would be needed to fully answer this question. For the recruitment trigger specifically, this is where the PDT and TC have some questions for the board today. As we heard earlier, the recruitment trigger was triggered once by the North Carolina JAI in 2020. There is concern about the trigger performance given this period of below average recruitment, and the TC has been working on exploring alternative options. So the TC took a look at, these are the 6 state JAIs, and took a look at the current recruitment trigger and noted that that current trigger for recruitment failure would have been tripped historically for most of these indices during the late 1970s and early 1980s. And you can see those little filled in yellow dots are times when the trigger would have been tripped. And those correspond to a time period of very low abundance and poor recruitment. So the first question for the board is just confirming what information does the board want the trigger to provide? So the TC noted that if the intent of the trigger is to identify true periods of recruitment failure, so these long periods of very low recruitment events like in the 1970s and 1980s, then the current trigger is sufficient to indicate when these recruitment failure periods are happening. However, if the board is interested in the trigger tripping for periods of below average recruitment that aren't necessarily at historically low levels, but might allow the board to be more precautionary with management, then the trigger would need to be revised. So overall, the TC is looking at several different options. They're looking at different trigger mechanisms. So for example, a 3-year average, a different reference point, for example, a median, a different reference period that would exclude those periods of low recruitment. The TC has found that in order for the trigger to be more sensitive, those years with very low recruitment need to be excluded from that reference period. The TC is also considering options to only use a subset of the 6 juvenile abundance indices that are currently used. And the TC has discussed at the recommendation of the board the potential to look at age 1 indices, but those indices did not provide any additional or different information, so the TC does not recommend including those. And then finally, the TC is thinking about the estimates of recruitment from the model and how those could be used versus the JAIs, which are currently used. So then the second question for the board is, how does the board intend to use a trigger that would trip during these periods of below average recruitment? And really, what type of management response would the board consider? So right now, the board decides on the appropriate management response when the trigger is tripped. So there's no specific management response that is required. So a potential option for this to consider in this amendment would be to update that management response to a more specific action that would protect those weak year classes. And the TC, in thinking about what are some potential options that the board could consider, the TC noted the board could consider redefining the fishing mortality target or the rebuilding framework to be more precautionary. So, for example, if recruitment is below average, then the calculated fishing mortality target, assuming this low recruitment regime, would actually be lower than the current F that's calculated based on average recruitment over that time period. So if the recruitment trigger was tripped, the board could, for example, take action to reduce fishing mortality to that lower fishing mortality target that takes into account that low recruitment. The board could also use this low recruitment assumption when they're developing a rebuilding plan and thinking about the action that would need to be taken to achieve the targets. So just in summary here, Mr. Chair, in these 2 questions for board feedback is, what information does the board want the recruitment trigger to provide? And then how does the board intend to use the trigger, and what type of management response would be considered? And for example, this option of potentially redefining the fishing mortality target, is that something that the board would consider as a potential response to this trigger?
All right, you've got, thank you, Emily. You got 2 questions. Let's take them in order. In terms of the recruitment trigger, what's the preference of the board on the 2 options? Hands up.
Right now I have Mike Armstrong.
Mike?
Yeah, I think we have a real opportunity to be precautionary and to do something that could be very effective. Right now, we track recruitment failure. And sometimes it's a surprise, sometimes it's not. And again, our ability to address the causes of that, it's usually not SSB, it's usually environmental. So that's difficult, but the only thing we can do is to reduce F and try and maintain SSB. So towards that, I think we should be targeting a period of low recruitment rather than recruitment failure. We had 5 years of average to poor recruitment. We did not that much very quickly, and we ended up with the SSB we have now, which is reduced. So I think to be more precautionary, we should look at a trigger that is geared around below average as opposed to recruitment failure. And I have a lot more to say about that, but I won't say it now.
Mike. Mike prefers option 2. Other comments?
I don't have any other hands.
Anyone object to including option 2? Any objection?
John Clark.
John Clark?
Oh, there it goes. Okay, now I'm unmuted. Not an objection. I was just a little more explanation there based on what Mike Armstrong said. I thought we still don't have a strong stock recruit relationship for striped bass, so I'm just curious as to what the object would be to reduce F early on in the process of having like the poor recruitment we've seen these past few years. Is this really going to make a difference? Just more curious. I guess that's more of a assessment question there. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Anyone else on this issue? Then we'll conclude. We'll include option 2.
I have a couple hands up. Mike Luisi, and then I think Mike Armstrong wants a second bite at the apple.
Mike Luisi.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. This is a question for Emily, maybe in regards to the discussions that have been ongoing with the PDT. So when there's a recruitment failure, let's say a couple years go by and they're, depending on what that failure is defined as, and there's action that's necessary. So, you know, those fish that are part of that failure, they maintain residency within certain areas, certain nursery areas for a number of years. Has the PDT been discussing what actions would be necessary? Would those actions fall to the areas for which the recruitment failure happened, or would it be a coast-wide consideration of the failure and changes to future management? I just wonder what you guys have been talking about as far as where the focus would be when there is a recruitment failure, whether it's in the Hudson or Delaware or Chesapeake, or, you know, we just heard about down in North Carolina, there's failure down there as well. So where would that focus be as far as who needs to take those necessary reductions?
Thanks, Mike. So the TC has really kept the discussion at a coast-wide level. I think, you know, part of it is currently the status quo response is that it's at the board's discretion what the appropriate action would be. But since the trigger hasn't been tripped until this year, there haven't been any examples of, you know, what the appropriate action might be if only one juvenile abundance index, for example, showed recruitment failure in a certain area. So the TC hasn't really discussed, you know, if a specific region would have to take on the responsibility of responding to the trigger. Everything has been coast-wide at this point. One of the things the TC has discussed is, again, thinking about which juvenile abundance indices would be part of the trigger, even potentially thinking about, you know, should the trigger require that more than one abundance index, you know, trips the trigger, or some combination of that. So I think indirectly the TC is sort of thinking about the spatial differences, but as far as the management response, the discussion has only been at the coast-wide level.
Okay, thanks, Emily, for that. I appreciate it. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. That's all I have.
Tony, anyone else with their hand up?
It was just Mike Armstrong.
Mike, you get the last word on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to respond. You know, low recruitment it's a warning that SSB is going to drop if we keep removals at the same rate. That's just going to happen. And it's not just about SSB. The relationship is very loose until you get to lower SSB, and then there is a relationship. But it also reflects that the fishing experience gets lousy. People are complaining, and it's clear they want more. They don't say SSB, but ultimately that's what it means. They want more fish and big fish in the water. So I'm talking about using low recruitment as a proactive way to start management actions, probably a few years before we actually see it coming along. That's how I see it.
Thanks, Mike. We're going to move on to the second question. You got two options, preferences. Please put your hands up.
No hands yet.
No hands up. Nope. No preferences. Anyone have an opinion?
Megan Ware, and then
Megan.
followed by Mike Armstrong.
Megan and then Mike.
So I think this is maybe more of a question for Emily, but it seems like for that second question there, if you have two different F targets, one for low recruitment and one for regular recruitment, you'd have to have two sets of measures, and that starts to sound like the harvest control rule that's happening in the rec reform document. And I'm wondering if the PDT has had any discussion about relationship to kind of that style of management.
Thanks, Megan. The TC, in terms of how long would this F target be in place if the board were to respond to the recruitment trigger by redefining the F target to that lower, under that F target, under that low recruitment assumption. The example thus far has been that until the recruitment trigger is no longer tripped, the TC could potentially come up with a few other options. Maybe it's that new F is in place for a couple of years or until the next assessment. But in terms of that changing reference points, over time, that sort of general challenge hasn't really been discussed at the TC level, but I assume it will be something that comes up at the PDT level in terms of the complexity associated with this type of management response.
Thanks, Emily. Mike Armstrong.
Without prolonging things too much, I'll just say if you believe what I said on the first piece, that we should react to below average recruitment rather than recruitment failure, I think the reaction should be to reduce F and to consider using projections using a low recruitment regime. It's the precautionary approach, and I'd like to hear the opinions of people. They're going to have to pay a price to be precautionary, but do they want a high stock and less ability to harvest more fish? So anyway, I think the second option is, but I'm not against the, keeping in both too, moving forward.
Any other hands up, Tom?
Jason McMee and then Craig Pugh.
Jason, and then we'll go to Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I agree with what Mike Armstrong just said. My preference is I like that second bullet there under the question as well. I guess what I was pondering without raising my hand in the beginning there was the status quo response is just board discretion, right? So isn't it, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I guess I was thinking that the first bullet was inclusive of the second bullet. So I wasn't inclined to remove either, but just to make the comment, I do like this idea of accounting for periods of low productivity and sort of accounting for that. I think is a good idea. Just like Mike just said, it's more a matter of what the first bullet means. And I thought it meant it's discretionary for the board.
Thanks, Jason. Craig?
Yes, my question would be, in periods of the opposite, in high recruitment, would that result in a sunset of these restrictions as we go on with these discussions? It seems as though we're focused on this low recruitment, as though it's going to be an anomaly that stays with us forever. But if we do have periods of high recruitment, what's going to be a response back to the fishery?
This is Emily, Mr. Chair. So the TC, has discussed the potential for, if there is this option to calculate a new F based on a low recruitment assumption, then there could be an option to calculate a new fishing mortality target based on a high recruitment assumption. So that is something that the TC could include in the draft, or could recommend that the PDT include in the draft amendment.
Anyone else? I just make the simple point that to some extent, the board always maintains the option to do an addendum in response to a condition like this. And so that's also on the table.
I have one last hand, and that's Tom Fody.
Tom Fody.
We basically manage for recruitment, yet when we do stock assessments and we look at the stock assessment, we say spawning stock by summer flounder has no effect, it seems to be, on recruitment. I mean, at half the half the spawning stock bass that we had in summer flounder, we had better recruitment, and we've been trying to maintain this high spawning stock biomass and just had poor recruitment all along. And when we basically shut down wheatfish, when we shut down winter flounder, it hasn't done anything for recruitment. We basically stopped fishing for them, and really in the same. So I'm not ready to basically start panicking when you have average or below average recruitment.
So Emily, it sounds like we've got a few different positions here, and I guess my take is let the PDT kind of develop both, unless somebody objects.
No hands.
Okay, so we're going to move on because we're going to run out of time here. Anything else on this agenda item, Emily?
I just have one more slide on the 2015 year class in case folks were wondering why that issue hasn't come up yet. Again, there's concern the 2015s are entering the slot limit. Some concern they have already entered the slot limit, and the TC is currently working on analysis both to estimate the size and age of these year classes over time, and also to estimate the distribution of those year classes by size. So the TC is working on this analysis and will report to the PDT with those recommendations. And then just to wrap up, the PDT and TC will continue to meet over the next several weeks, again, with the intent of providing the board with a draft amendment document in October. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair. I just want to say thanks so much to all the board members for all their feedback today.
Okay, Emily, if you'd like to move on to item 7 on the agenda, please.
Sure, Mr. Chair.
And while you're getting organized up, let me just say that in anticipation, this issue came up at the last board meeting. The vote, as most of you will recall, was a tie vote, so it failed. And as a response to that, I requested that, given the number of individuals who spoke in favor of trying to do something, I asked the state of Delaware delegation to meet with the commission staff and further develop options for consideration at this board meeting. So that has been done. and you're going to get a report on that. So, Emily?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I pulled up the presentation here on the screen. I just have a couple of slides that just outline the content that was in the memo that was part of supplemental materials. So as the chair just mentioned, he requested that staff from the Commission and State of Delaware prepare options and timelines for addressing this issue. Delaware has raised this issue for several years, and there was some interest at the last board meeting in reviewing more recent data for commercial allocation. There was also some concern that addressing commercial allocation in Draft Amendment 7 would make the amendment process longer and more complex. So in response to that request, the commissioners from the state of Delaware developed options to potentially address their concerns, and then commission staff prepared some perspective on the process and timeline, considering that Draft Amendment 7 is currently being developed at this time. So this is the list of options that the state of Delaware has developed to address their concerns about commercial quota allocation, and a full description of each is included in the memo. And just as a quick overview, staff perspective on these issues, thinking about option B, which is allowing for a commercial quota transfer, voluntary transfers from a staff perspective, this option could potentially be developed as an addendum to Amendment 6, concurrent with the development of Draft Amendment 7. Also, since this option is less complex, it doesn't have that same complexity as some of the other options, the board could potentially consider adding it to Draft Amendment 7 to sort of streamline that process. For the rest of the options, starting with sub-option 2, which is voluntary transfers, but only to other states that filled their commercial quota, reallocating commercial quotas based on historical quotas, fishery management, and fishery performance, and then the option where quotas would be adjusted based on contribution of the estuary to the coastal spawning stock. From staff perspective, the complexity of those options would mean that those would likely need to be addressed after Amendment 7 is approved in an addendum to Amendment 7. So again, a little bit more specific perspective. If the board decided to pursue this proposed option that would allow voluntary quota transfers, from staff perspective, this option could potentially be developed alongside Amendment 7 as an addendum to Amendment 6 with some caveats. So commission staff would not be available to conduct individual state hearings, but could conduct up to 3 webinar hearings. States could hold additional hearings on their own. Commission staff would have a preference for collecting public comment via a survey. And if this option were developed as an addendum to Amendment 6, this could potentially be implemented in 2022. Additionally, since this option doesn't have the same complexity as some of the other options do, the board could potentially consider including this type of voluntary transfer option in Draft Amendment 7. And from a staff perspective, this would streamline the development of that option with the current Amendment 7 process, and the estimated implementation date for that would be 2023. So that's the commission staff perspective on this sub-option 1, voluntary transfers. And then for the remaining options, again, sub-option 2, voluntary transfers, but only to other states that filled their commercial quota. Option C, which would reallocate quotas based on certain criteria related to Amendment 6 historical quotas, fishery management, and recent fishery performance, as well as option D, which would adjust the quotas based on contribution of the estuary to the spawning stock. From a commission staff perspective, the complexity of these options would result in these options likely needing to be pursued as an addendum to Amendment 7. So that would be after final action is taken on draft Amendment 7. This is the same slide that I had up before, just a quick summary. And again, I just want to say thank you to the commissioners from the state of Delaware for developing these options. And I will turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Emily. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to go to the Delaware delegation for John Clark and his delegation opportunity to offer any comments, and then we'll take general questions on this or comments. So, John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Emily, and thanks to Emily and Tony for working with us to develop these options. Tried to keep it very simple and tried to look for a option, you know, as Emily pointed out, the first option there is voluntary transfers. We're not trying to do a full reallocation everywhere because we know how fraught that process would be. Just looking to get more in the simplest way possible here. We also understand that there might be some concern with just voluntary transfers because it could end up with more questions of states asking for transfers that maybe they don't really need or what have you. And so we added some criteria first with the sub option 2 there to at least make sure that transfer would only go to states that had filled their quota the previous year. For option C, adding the specificity there, we thought would help. It would really narrow down where the quota could come from and where the quota could go to. And I'm sure if anybody who's read through it saw that really the only state that would qualify under all 3 criteria would be Delaware. Some of those, the performance measures I put in there, the criteria that we put in there, also demonstrate just the small scale of the fishery in Delaware. I mean, the fact that striped bass are over 50% of our total commercial finfish landings for each of the past 5 years shows that we are, you know, very traditional small scale fishery here. And the fact that one of the other criteria was double tagging the fish. Our fishermen tag the fish. Another tag has to be put on by a weigh station. It just shows how we are managing this fishery very carefully. The fishermen cooperate fully in that. And finally, the last option there was just to bring back the whole idea that we brought up several times to the board about the producer area status. It was just a very back of the envelope thought exercise there, but if there was any desire to start looking into producer area status again, put that in there also. But as I said, try to keep things simple, and hopefully we can use this process to increase Delaware's quota without causing a huge debate over reallocation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, John. Any other representatives from Delaware want to speak to this?
Craig Pugh has his hand up.
Craig?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to thank staff for helping us develop this. It's been a long time coming to have this conversation. And, you know, it's been our long-term thoughts here that, and that it's the undeniable fact that the inequities and balance that are supposed to be provided to us through the charter and the 5-year strategic plan have not applied to the state of Delaware. For some reason, we've been shuffled out here. We'd like to be included in a more fair, balanced, equitable dispersion of the allocation. And we feel as though maybe some of these options, if allowed, would help us along with that process. And I guess the last point I want to make, it's kind of laughable that about a half hour ago, that the TC recommended that the 1970s and 1980 data is unacceptable for their triggers, but yet is the acceptable commercial harvest process that we live under, which seems to have encumbered this problem upon the state of Delaware. So it's kind of nice to see that some of these conversations are able to be had. And I'm looking forward to this forward discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Anyone else on this? So there are no hands up from the delegation. Let me ask for general comments on this. And my assumption, Emily, is this will require a motion. At the end, if we're going to proceed with one course of action, obviously we could delay action until next meeting and let everybody digest this. But let's take a few comments. Comments on the concept.
We have Mike Armstrong and Pat Gear.
Mike and then Pat.
Thank you. Just a quick question. If we added option B, sub option 1, voluntary transfers to this amendment, you mentioned the implementation would be 2023. I thought the original timeline for the amendment was 2022 in spring. So are you saying if we add this to the amendment, we would prolong the time frame, or just for the implementation of this particular option?
Hi, Mike, this is Emily. So I think the implementation date for Amendment 7 conservatively is 2023. If we stay on this timeline of approving the final Amendment 7 is February, I think there's some question as to what provisions from that amendment could be implemented that same year in 2022. So to answer your question of would adding this particular issue to the amendment prolong the full amendment timeline? No, it would not. I think the final implementation date for Amendment 7, maybe some parts of it could be implemented in 22. I think the PDT just isn't sure if this amendment is approved in February, what could be implemented immediately.
Tony, was it Pat Gear?
Yes, followed by Emerson Hasbrook.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I just have a question to one of our striped bass historians about why transfers are not allowed in this fishery. Does someone have an answer to that? Why has it never been allowed?
Someone want to speak to that?
I can't say why the board chose not to allow them, but it was considered in a previous document. I see Bob has his hand up. Maybe he can say why.
Bob?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Pat, my recollection is that they were not allowed while we were, even before my time, the board was trying to rebuild the striped bass stock. Now that it, and then once it was rebuilt, the board sort of felt comfortable with not allowing transfers. Part of it had to do with where those fish came from, and if you move fish from North Carolina to Maine, North Carolina to Massachusetts, that's probably the farthest commercial quotas. Would that impact differentially where those fish came from and the spawning populations and that sort of thing? But again, most of it is a holdover from the rebuilding days of the early 90s.
Okay, thanks.
And then Mike Armstrong.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Already asked my question. Answered. Thank you.
Who did I miss, Tony?
You have Emerson Hasbrook followed by Roy Miller.
Emerson and then Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I would certainly support consideration of option B, sub option 1, voluntary voluntary transfers, either as an addendum to Amendment 6 or to add this into draft Amendment 7. So I'd support moving that forward in some fashion, or at least considering moving that forward in some fashion. Let's hear what the public has to say about it. In terms of anything with option C and option D, reading the details that were in the memo in our reading materials, I have some issues and concerns about option C and option D. I don't know that right now is the time to get into that, especially if we're not considering any action on those. But once we do, or if we do, go forward with anything in option C and D, I think we need to have an in-depth discussion about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thanks, Emerson. My question to staff is, do we need to? Obviously, it would be helpful. Obviously, it would be helpful to provide some guidance on where we want to go to the staff today. But do we need to make the final decision today to commit to a path, or will that, because you got two options, or will that decision be made at a subsequent meeting? So, Emily, I think that's probably a question to you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if the board wanted to pursue sub-option 1, voluntary transfers through either an addendum to Amendment 6 or through adding that to draft Amendment 7, that would need to be addressed today in order to get that process started, because we intend to have a draft amendment document by next meeting. So we would need to know if we were to add it to that document, and in order to get have an estimated implementation of 2022 through an addendum to Amendment 6, I think that would also need to start today.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So, Tony, who else do you have on the list?
I had Roy Miller, Joe Cimino, and Richie White.
Richie. Okay, Roy, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to agree with what Bob said regarding the history of this process. We were in a rebuilding mode from the 1980s until the mid-1990s. This is from someone who was there during that time. And it carried over into the restoration of the coastwide stock and even the Delaware stock in the mid-1990s. And it's just something we hadn't dealt with since then. So those transfers, when we were in a rebuilding mode, no one wanted to consider transfers. And once the stock was declared restored, the subject hadn't come up again until very recently. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. Joe Cimino.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I do have some concern with starting an addendum process in the midst of with all of this. I am not opposed to option B, sub option A being carried out to the public, and I think maybe having that done in draft Amendment 7 makes sense. I could support that. Thank you.
Okay, let's see, Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question where this was not in the first document to go out to the public, when we do an amendment, is it appropriate that we bring something in at this time? So that's just a question. And secondly, I'm not opposed to the sub option 1, but would there be any constraints on that? When I look at North Carolina and even Massachusetts not filling theirs in the last few years, there could be, fairly substantial transfers that get harvested that then increase mortality. So I guess that would be a concern. So I guess I have concern over the can we bring this in at this time in an amendment would be the biggest question. Thank you.
Richie, to that point, the staff can take a counterpoint if they believe this is incorrect. This issue was raised during the scoping meetings, I believe, by the representatives from Delaware. So it was, I'm not sure I totally understand your point. It has been raised as part of Amendment 7, and obviously the board has the right to do an addendum as part of Amendment 6. So I'm missing the point. It was raised as part of the process. And the staff, please correct me if I misspeak.
What follow up?
Yeah, just let's try to get the staff to give us the history instead of going on my recollection. Was this raised as part of the scoping process?
You're correct.
I'm correct. Okay, so Richie, you want to follow up?
Yes, it's bringing it back into the amendment where it was not voted to continue in, and the public saw that. I guess I'm more comfortable with an addendum than bringing it back into the draft amendment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Richie. Does anyone from the Delaware have a draft motion that they'd like the board to consider? Seems to be that, and I'm not trying to put words in everybody's mouth, you've got some support around option B, particularly sub-option 1. There have been a number of people who have spoken in favor of that and talked about the complications with option C and D. So, John, do you or somebody on your delegation want to make a motion?
John Clark.
Sure. Yeah, I sure would, Mr. Chair. I would move to initiate an addendum to allow voluntary transfers of striped bass quota. And if I could just, for Richie's concern about the transfers, that's why we had the other options in there, Richie, to try to limit where the transfers would go. But obviously that would be an issue once the amendment is actually done. Thank you.
So I have a motion by Mr. Clark. Is there a second to the motion?
I have Pat Gear.
Seconded by Pat Gear. Discussion on the motion. Any hands?
Just really quickly before we go to comments, and I'm going to recreate my list. Can we say allow voluntary transfers of commercial striped bass quota?
John, that you agree to that perfection?
That's fine with me, yes.
How about you, Pat? You agree?
Yes, I'm fine with that.
Okay. So any other perfections, Tony?
That is all my perfections. I have on the list here Megan Ware and Mike Armstrong, and I'll have additional names for you.
Okay. Got Megan and then Mike.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm not really sure how I'm going to vote on this, and I think what's giving me pause is it sounds like in kind of the history recap we've had on transfers, the board decided not to use transfers in a rebuilding period, yet we're finding ourselves in that same situation now, and so I'm a little concerned that transfers are going to increase the catch, and is that counter kind of to the status of the stock that we're in right now? I actually think Delaware has a very strong argument for wanting to review allocation, particularly when we discussed it on the striped bass work group. There had a lot of merit to their argument. So I'm not sure how I'm going to vote on this, but I am a little concerned about kind of what this could lead to and the status of our stock.
Thanks, Megan. Mike Armstrong.
I would vote against this right now. I think the actual addendum needs to be pretty comprehensive, and I think there's more options that need to be considered than what Delaware has brought forward. I think the first one of voluntary transfers is, if I was Delaware, would not be very satisfying to me. To have to come with your hand out and depend on the largesse of Massachusetts, for instance. I don't know how you plan your commercial fishery that way. So I think we need a full amendment with a fair amount of options and a lot of discussion. And for that reason, I would rather it be an amendment to, an addendum to Amendment 7, which will only delay the process. Will be essentially done hopefully in February. So I don't think it's kicking the can down the road too much. And I think it would be more effective to be able to concentrate fully on an addendum like this. Thank you.
Anyone else? Tony on the left.
Yep, Tom Foti and then Mike Luisi.
All right, Tom, and then Mike.
Yeah. We have a striped bass stock that we say is overfished, and overfishing is taking place. We are putting a lot more restrictions on the recreational sector. At the same time, we're going to allow transfers of unused commercial fish from one state to another, and also, where states are leaving fish in the water. I mean, it'll make the public hearing process a lot more interesting. I don't know. I think it's better done. We finish Amendment 7 and do this as an addendum after Amendment 7 is passed, because this is going to complicate the public hearing process. Because I can see everything else getting drowned out by, people that don't want to see any increases in the commercial fishery.
Mike Luisi, and let me encourage future speakers to start by saying they're in favor or opposed. It would be useful. Mike Luisi.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. So I'm in favor of the concept. Fully support my colleagues in Delaware for their interest in trying to find a way to add to their commercial striped bass quota. What I don't understand from the motion is the timing, and it goes to the last two commenters. It says initiate an addendum. Is that an addendum to Amendment 6 that's going to start now? Is that an addendum to Amendment 7, which, as Mike and Tom just alluded to, will be finalized hopefully in the late winter, early spring of next year? That's a question for John as to what the intent here is. Personally, I would prefer that we get through Amendment 7 first and then work on an addendum to Amendment 7, where this commercial issue, as Mike mentioned, could be more fleshed out. There could be other options discussed, and it would just be more comprehensive. So that's a question for John, and then for you, Mr. Chairman. So I support the concept. I'm just not sure as to what it actually means based on the language in the motion.
Thanks, Mike. John, could you provide a little bit more guidance or
yeah, sure. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I had intended for an addendum to Amendment 6 based on the input we just had from Emily and Tony, that to start an addendum for Amendment 6, we'd have to start today. But I understand some of the hesitation. This is obviously a very basic motion here. If you look at our memo, what we were getting at here, A, the board would have to approve any transfers. B, it would only be for a year. And if you look at the situation, the main situation we have where quota is going unused is North Carolina, which has about close to 300,000 pounds of coastal striped bass commercial quota that's being unused. Delaware would not be asking for all of that by any means. I just want to allay fears of what we would be asking for. So I think this could work. As I said, we tried to do things as simply as possible and in a way that would have the least amount of impact to, obviously, to the stock and also to other states and to the commercial fishery in general. So If there's any other questions about what we were intending here, I could answer those, but I hope that explains it a little more. Thanks.
So, John, do you want to perfect the motion so it reads, move to initiate an addendum to Amendment 6? Add in Amendment 6?
Yes, that would be good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Pat, is that perfection all right with you?
Yeah, yes, I'm fine with that. I wanted to open the discussion on this, so I'm fine with this.
Okay. So additional discussion on this? Hands up, Tony.
I had Roy Miller. John Clark, I don't know if your hand is intentionally still up. No, it's not. And I think Roy just took his hand down on a, and then Cherie Patterson.
Roy, I'm unclear whether your hand's up or down.
I put it down, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, because I can't see the hands. So, Cherie?
Cherie, yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I'm still kind of waffling on this one. I think that there's some unintended consequences that aren't really defined here that I think needs to be further fleshed out. And that might happen with when you initiate this addendum. But one of my concerns here is all of a sudden seeing states that don't have a commercial fishery for striped bass currently, they have no quota, no fishery. All of a sudden, those states can now receive commercial striped bass quota. I don't think that's the intent of Mr. Clark. I'm thinking he's just thinking it's going to move around similar to what we do with Menhaden and such. But I think there's some unintended consequences here that need to be further thought through. So do we want to allow voluntary transfers of commercial striped bass quota and just put a caveat that this is only for states that have a commercial quota? Thanks.
You have John Clark.
John?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, not to change the motion yet again, but perhaps it would allay some of Cherie's concerns there if we put in there, allow voluntary transfers of commercial striped bass quota as outlined in the memo of July, what was the date there? It was the memo of July 26, 2021 to the Striped Bass Management Board regarding these transfers.
Right. We've got another perfection. Pat, are you all okay with this perfection?
I'm okay with this. I might suggest doing it a little simpler by saying voluntary commercial striped bass quota transfers to any state presently holding quota or something like that. But I mean, it's in the memo. I was just trying to, instead of referencing the memo saying it's only for states that presently, hold quota.
John, is that what your intent is? And if you say yes, I think we can leave the motion the way it is.
Yeah, that's fine.
In the record.
Yeah, because I mean the motion, as with Amendment 6, we're only talking about states that have commercial striped bass quota. Thank you.
Okay, and I ask that be part of the record.
Okay.
So further discussion on this.
I have Richie White, and then I'll have a follow-up question at the end, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we're over our time slot here. We've still got one agenda item on the agenda, so I'm going to limit the discussion and basically call a question on this after a couple more points. Richie?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm opposed to this as written. I could support if it was an amendment, addendum to Amendment 7. We're rushing this too fast. There's a lot of issues that are not flushed out yet. I'm in favor of the general concept, but concerned with some of the details. And I'm just saying that any state that has a commercial quota, New Hampshire has a couple thousand pounds. Maine has, I think, 400 or something. So the idea that then those states could open up, a substantial commercial fishery, I think is not the direction the board wants to go. So I'd like to see this slow down a little bit and see it be an addendum to Amendment 7. Thank you.
All right, Tony, do you have, you want to comment, but is there anyone else on the list?
I don't have any additional hands at this time.
Okay, so Tony, you get the last word, and then I'm going to ask for a 2-minute caucus period, and then we're going to call a question.
I just want to reiterate the sort of preferences of staff in terms of how the amendment process would work. One of the reasons why we said we could do this is that we said we would do 3 virtual public hearings. We would not hold individual state hearings. And I just want to make sure that that's clear. And staff has a strong preference to conduct the comments by survey. It still includes the ability to do open comments, but it'll help us sort the comments in a much more efficient way. And so I just want to put those 2 things out there to make sure that everyone understands that that's what we would be agreeing, or at least the hearings we'd be agreeing to.
Yeah,
if we move forward with this.
Tony, thank you for raising that. That was part of Emily's presentation, and I just point out my interpretation was there was no objection by any board member to doing that. So I think you've got a directive from the board to conduct the hearings in that manner. So I'm going to declare a 2-minute break for a caucus. We'll reconvene at 12:54. Oh, we get the timer on. Thank you. All right, time is up. Are we back on?
I'm here.
Okay, are you ready for the question?
I'm ready.
Okay, Tony, so we have a clear vote. Could you call a roll, please?
I can.
Or would you prefer? Do you prefer to just call a vote? And we need to have the states individually identified how they vote.
I'll do that when they raise their hands. Can you read the motion?
Okay, so all those states in favor of the motion to initiate an addendum to Amendment 6, and I'll read it in the record. Move to initiate an addendum to Amendment 6 to allow voluntary transfers of commercial striped bass quota as outlined in the memo of July 26, 2021 to the Atlantic Striped Bass Management Board regarding these transfers. It was motioned by Mr. Clark, seconded by Mr. Gear. All those in favor of the motion signify by raising your hand.
I have Connecticut, Delaware, Virginia, New York, Rhode Island, Maryland, North Carolina, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, and Maine.
Okay, thank you. If you'd put down the hands, all those in opposition to the motion, please put up your hand.
Tony, just to clarify, Maine did not vote yes on that, is my understanding. I don't think I have it raised.
I'm going to need to put the hands down, and people are going to have to re-raise their hand for those in opposition, and I have removed Maine from a yes. And I need to have the hands come back up now for those in opposition. I have NOAA Fisheries, Maine, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Fish and Wildlife Service.
All right, if you'd put the hands down, Tony, if you could.
I'm ready.
Are you ready? Any null votes? Any hands up?
I have no hands.
Any abstentions?
I have no hands.
Okay, so Tony, could you give me the count, the final count, please?
Emily, did you get 8?
Yes, I have 8 in favor, 7 opposed.
All right, so the final vote is 8700. Motion passes. Okay, anything else on this issue? If not, we've got one other item on the agenda, which is approval of advisory board members. Tina Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer for your consideration and approval two advisory nominees from Maryland, Chris Dollar, an outdoor columnist and fishing guide, and Charles Green, a for-hire captain. Both of these nominees fill vacant seats on the panel. Thank you.
Any questions on that? Any hands up, Tony? Any objection to approving this recommendation?
I have no hand in objection.
No hands up. The motion stands approved with unanimous agreement. Any other issues to come before the board?
Mr. Chair, I think we need a motion maker and seconder.
Oh, okay.
We have Mike Luisi and Marty Gary as maker and seconder.
Yeah, that's the second time I've gotten ahead of myself today. Thank you, Mike and Marty, for the motion. So we have a motion. Any objections to the motion? If there are no hands up, the motion stands approved by unanimous consent.
No hands are up.
Okay, so is there anything else to come before the board today? We're close to being on time, I would point out.
Yeah.
If no hands up, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, all. And Emily, thank you for all your work on this, and Tony and the rest of the staff. Thank you.